Imagine a world where everything you know disappears in an instant. Cities crumble, governments fall, and the very fabric of society unravels into chaos. Entire civilizations vanish almost overnight, leaving behind nothing but scattered ruins and fading whispers of their existence. Yet somehow, against all conceivable odds, these societies find a way to rise again from the ashes, rebuilding themselves in complete secrecy, hidden from the watching eyes of history. This is not just a story of survival, it is the incredible saga of the kingdoms that rebuilt themselves in secret after total collapse, a profound testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the unbreakable will to endure. Think about what it truly means to face total collapse. It's not merely the fall of a government or the collapse of an economy. It's the complete disintegration of social order, cultural identity, and daily life. Natural disasters, invasions, plagues, these forces can erase centuries of progress in a single devastating blow, leaving survivors scattered, desperate, and stripped of everything they once knew. In these moments of absolute crisis, ordinary people are forced to make extraordinary choices. They retreat into remote mountains, hidden valleys, and forgotten corners of the world, carrying with them the embers of their culture, their knowledge, and their hope. There, away from prying eyes, they begin the painstaking work of rebuilding, preserving what matters most, and forging new destinies in the shadows. What you are about to discover is not just a collection of historical facts, but a deeply human story that echoes across the ages. From the secret revival of the Minoans after the catastrophic eruption of Thera to the hidden networks of the Knights Templar, from the resilient Gaelic clans who preserved their culture amid Viking raids to the clandestine communities of the Jewish diaspora in medieval Europe, these stories reveal a pattern of breathtaking adaptability and courage. We will journey together into the heart of these hidden rebirths, uncovering the strategies, the secrets, and the sheer determination that allowed these kingdoms to defy extinction. By the end, you will not only gain a new appreciation for humanity's capacity to overcome, you may also find powerful lessons that resonate with our own modern world, offering insights into how we, too, might navigate crisis and renewal. This is a voyage into the greatest mysteries of survival, and it all starts now. Total collapse is not a single event but a shattering cascade of failures that rips apart the very foundation of a society. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the world you knew is simply gone. The familiar hum of commerce in the marketplace has been replaced by an eerie silence. The roads once patrolled by soldiers are now empty or controlled by bands of desperate scavengers. The laws that governed your life, the currency you used to buy bread, the social hierarchies that provided order, all of it has evaporated into thin air. This is the true meaning of total collapse. It goes far beyond the fall of a king or the bankruptcy of a treasury. It is the complete and utter disintegration of the complex web of trust, cooperation, and shared identity that allows a civilization to function. Daily life becomes a relentless struggle for the most basic necessities: clean water, safe shelter, and protection from violence. The shared stories, rituals, and artistic expressions that defined a culture are often the first luxuries to be abandoned in the fight for sheer survival, risking the erasure of a people's entire identity. This terrifying unraveling can be triggered by a multitude of catastrophic forces. A colossal volcanic eruption, like the one that buried the Minoan settlements in ash and triggered tsunamis, can devastate a region in a matter of days. A sudden, dramatic shift in climate can lead to generations of drought and famine, as scholars believe happened to the Maya, whose magnificent cities were slowly reclaimed by the jungle as their agricultural systems failed. Or consider the swift and brutal arrival of an unstoppable invading force, which not only conquers but systematically dismantles the existing social order, scattering populations and suppressing their traditions. The late Bronze Age collapse stands as a chilling example of a perfect storm, where a combination of natural disasters, mass migrations, and the mysterious sea peoples led to the burning of nearly every major city from Greece to Egypt within a single generation. The great palaces of the Mycenaeans and the Hittite Empire fell into ruin, literacy vanished, and intricate trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean lay broken for centuries. In the immediate aftermath of such a disaster, a profound vacuum emerges. The old systems of authority and distribution are gone, but new ones cannot be instantly created. This period is perhaps the most dangerous and psychologically devastating. Survivors are left not only with physical trauma, but with a deep existential crisis. Everything they believed to be permanent and secure has proven to be fragile. Trust in neighbors erodes as resources become scarce. The collective knowledge and specialized skills that powered advanced society, engineering, administration, scholarship become scattered and diluted, at risk of being lost forever. Logistically, the challenges are overwhelming. How do you rebuild a community when you cannot be sure who is an ally? How do you preserve sacred texts when you are constantly on the move? How do you plan for a future when every day is consumed by the immediate threat of starvation or attack? It is from within this rubble of both stone and spirit that the most incredible human stories emerge. The survivors face a stark choice: succumb to the chaos or begin the agonizingly slow, often secretive work of building something new from the fragments of the old. They must do this in isolation, often hiding from whatever new powers have filled the void, guarding their fragile flame of culture until it is strong enough to be seen once more. Understanding the absolute depth of this despair is what makes their eventual rebirth not just a historical footnote, but a truly astonishing testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most dramatic and tangible examples of this phenomenon, a story written in ash and preserved by the sea. Around the year 1600 before the Common Era, the island we now call Santorini was known as Thera, and it was the epicenter of one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. The blast was unimaginable, estimated to be many times more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa. For the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, just 70 miles to the south, this was not a distant rumble but an apocalyptic event. First came the earthquakes, shaking the very foundations of their magnificent palace complexes. Then, a towering column of ash blotted out the sun, plunging their world into a terrifying darkness and burying their fertile fields under a suffocating blanket of pumice and rock. But the worst was yet to come. The partial collapse of the volcanic island into the sea triggered a tsunami of staggering proportions, a wall of water that would have slammed into the northern coast of Crete with unimaginable force, scouring the landscape and obliterating the vibrant port cities that were the lifeblood of Minoan trade. This was not a slow decline but a near instantaneous decapitation of a sophisticated society. The Minoans were the first great civilization of Europe, a peaceful, matriarchal, and astonishingly artistic people whose palace at Knossos boasted advanced plumbing, intricate frescoes, and a complex written language we still cannot fully decipher. Their economy was built on maritime trade, their ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean to exchange exquisite pottery, saffron, and olive oil with Egypt and the Near East. In a single day, that world ended. The palaces Knossos, Phaistos, Malia were not burned by invaders but were abandoned, their grand courtyards and storage magazines left to the elements as the trade routes that sustained them vanished into silence. The central authority that organized their society, likely centered around a priest-king and a sprawling bureaucracy, simply ceased to function. The Minoans faced a total collapse that was economic, political, and spiritual. Yet the story does not end with the ashfall. This is where the secret rebirth begins. While the coastal centers were shattered, archaeological evidence points to a fascinating survival inland. High in the rugged mountains of eastern Crete, at places like the site of Carthage, new settlements emerged. These were not grand palaces but desperate refuges, villages of rough stone houses clinging to the slopes at an elevation of over 1,100 meters. Life here was a stark contrast to the luxurious existence of the past. The survivors shifted from a sophisticated maritime economy to a simple, resilient pastoralism, herding goats and sheep on terrain that was inhospitable but safe from further tsunamis and far from the coast, which was now vulnerable to raiders. This strategic retreat into the mountains was a deliberate act of hiding, a communal decision to preserve their people by becoming invisible. The historian Rodney Castleton, among others, argues persuasively that these refugee communities were not just surviving, they were actively preserving the essence of Minoan culture. Away from the destroyed centers of power, they kept their traditions alive. The distinctively Minoan goddess figurines, with their raised arms and serpents, continued to be crafted and worshipped in small mountain shrines. The language known to us as Linear A likely persisted in oral form even if the administrative need for its written form had vanished. Their craftsmanship, though simplified, carried on the artistic spirit of their ancestors. This clandestine cultural preservation had a profound and lasting impact. When the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece eventually came to dominate Crete, they did not encounter a blank slate. They absorbed these surviving Minoan elements, and the fusion of cultures gave birth to the brilliant Mycenaean palatial period. The myths that later Greek writers like Homer would record are filled with echoes of this hidden Minoan world. The legend of the Minotaur in its labyrinthine prison may be a distorted memory of the vast, confusing palace of Knossos and the bull-leaping ceremonies central to Minoan religion. The story of Atlantis, described by Plato as an advanced island kingdom that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night, is a hauntingly accurate echo of Thera's fate. The Minoan civilization in its public form was gone, but by going underground, both literally and culturally, its people ensured that their spirit would flow into the bloodstream of later Greek culture, and from there into the foundations of the Western world itself. Centuries later, and half a world away from the ash-covered ruins of Crete, another magnificent civilization faced its own slow-motion unraveling. Picture the great city of Ankara at its zenith in the 12th century, a sprawling metropolis of over 700,000 people, the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. Its heart was the breathtaking temple of Angkor Wat, a massive representation of the Hindu cosmos carved in stone, surrounded by a moat wider than a river. Canals and reservoirs known as barrays stretched to the horizon, a hydraulic engineering marvel that fed vast rice paddies and sustained a population of staggering size. This was the Khmer Empire, a powerhouse of art, architecture, and imperial might that dominated Southeast Asia. And then it was gone. By the 1500s, the grand capital was largely abandoned, its temples silently swallowed by the relentless jungle, its intricate water network choked with silt and roots. For centuries, the narrative was one of simple decline and mysterious disappearance. But we now know the truth is far more fascinating. The Khmer people did not vanish. They executed a strategic retreat, fading into the landscape to protect their very soul. The collapse of this empire wasn't caused by a single cataclysm, but by a devastating convergence of pressures. A series of prolonged droughts in the 14th century, followed by intense monsoons, shattered the delicate balance of their sophisticated water management system. This environmental stress crippled agricultural production, the foundation of their wealth and power. At the same time, external threats mounted. The burgeoning Ayutthaya kingdom, a rising power from what is now Thailand, began launching increasingly successful raids, sacking Angkor itself around 1431. Internally, the empire was likely straining under its own weight, with power struggles and a shift from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism altering the social contract that bound the god kings to their people. The result was the gradual abandonment of the grand urban center, but this was not a rout, it was a recalibration. The people did not simply scatter into the wind. They made a conscious choice to leave the vulnerable, centralized plain and seek refuge in the dense forests and remote highlands to the north and east. This is where modern technology has completely rewritten the history books. For a long time, the story of post-Angkorian Cambodia was one of silence. But the pioneering work of archaeologists like Damian Evans, using airborne laser scanning technology known as LIDAR, has peeled back the blanket of vegetation to reveal a secret world hidden for centuries. The LIDAR maps of the Phnom Kulen Plateau, a mountainous area northeast of Angkor, are nothing short of revolutionary. They show a sprawling, hidden urban landscape etched into the jungle floor, a complex network of roads, villages, temples, and most importantly, canals and ponds. This was no random scattering of refugees. This was a deliberate, organized effort to rebuild a society in a defensible, secluded location. The steep terrain and thick forest canopy provided a natural shield from the Ayutthaya raiders who plagued the lowlands. Here, away from the eyes of history, the Khmer culture found a way to endure. Life in these hidden enclaves was a direct continuation of the Khmer spirit, adapted to a new, more humble reality. They brought their profound knowledge of water management with them, carving out small, efficient reservoirs and canals on the mountain slopes to sustain rice cultivation and daily life. While the grand state-sponsored Hinduism faded, spiritual life continued in secluded forest monasteries and small village shrines, where Buddhism and ancestral traditions merged into a resilient personal faith. Oral histories, folk tales, and traditional music became the new libraries, safeguarding the myths and histories that once filled the stone inscriptions of Angkor. Artisans continued their crafts, producing distinctive pottery and textiles that preserved age-old aesthetic traditions. This clandestine preservation of knowledge and identity was a profound act of resistance. It was a societal choice to prioritize cultural survival over imperial glory. By becoming smaller, more dispersed, and hidden, they became far harder to eradicate. The legacy of this secret rebirth is etched into modern Cambodia. When a unified Cambodian kingdom re-emerged in later centuries with its capital downriver at Phnom Penh, it did not spring from nothing. It was rebuilt by the descendants of those who had safeguarded the Khmer way of life in the Highlands. The language, the religion, the artistic sensibilities, and the deep connection to the land, all were preserved during those centuries of quiet resilience. The story of the Khmer hinterlands powerfully demonstrates that a civilization's heart is not its grandest city, but its people and their enduring traditions. By choosing geographical seclusion and cultural stealth, they turned their retreat not into a defeat, but into a long, patient strategy for survival, ensuring that the empire's glorious past could one day inform a nation's future. Now shift the scene to the wild, windswept coasts of 9th century Ireland and Scotland, a world suddenly plunged into a nightmare of fire and terror. For the Gaelic kingdoms, life had long followed the rhythms of clan loyalties, intricate laws, and the profound spiritual influence of monasteries that served as the beating hearts of learning and art. Then, without warning, the dragon-prowed longships appeared on the horizon. The Viking onslaught was a shock of unparalleled violence, targeting the very centers of Gaelic wealth and culture. These Norse raiders were not interested in conquest and settlement at first. They sought plunder, and the island's monasteries, repositories of gold, silver, and exquisite religious artifacts, were ripe for the taking. Iona, the spiritual center of Gaelic Christianity, was attacked again and again, its monks martyred, its treasures looted, its sacred peace shattered by the axe and the torch. This was more than a military threat. It was a systemic attack on the pillars of society itself. The monastic networks that connected scholars across Europe were severed. The authority of local chieftains was challenged by relentless violence, and the entire Gaelic way of life seemed on the brink of being erased from the earth. Faced with this existential threat, the guardians of Gaelic culture made a radical and courageous decision. They would not stand and fight on open ground. Instead, they would vanish. Chieftains, scholars, and entire monastic communities gathered their most precious possessions, not just gold, but books, sacred relics, and the knowledge held in their minds, and retreated into the most remote and inhospitable landscapes of their world. They sought refuge in places so extreme they believed neither God nor Viking would easily find them. Perilous sea stacks like Skellig Michael, a jagged pinnacle of rock rising 700 feet from the Atlantic waves, became a new home for monks. They built their beehive-shaped stone huts and tiny oratories on virtually sheer cliff faces, growing their meager sustenance in terraced gardens and drawing water from cisterns carved into the rock. In Ireland, communities disappeared into the vast, trackless bogs, while in Scotland, they hid in deep glens and on isolated islands in the Hebrides. This strategic withdrawal created what historians call the Hidden Ireland and a Hidden Scotland, a parallel, clandestine world where the old ways could be protected and preserved away from the chaos of the coasts. Within these secret enclaves, a meticulous and quiet project of cultural salvation began. The monks, who were the scribes and scholars of their age, turned their remote cells into scriptoriums. By the flickering light of seal oil lamps, they continued to copy texts, not just religious scriptures but also works of history, poetry, and native law. They developed a unique, minuscule script that allowed them to conserve precious vellum, packing intricate wisdom into tiny, portable books. This was not merely an act of preservation, it was an act of defiance. Masterpieces like the Book of Kells, likely begun on Iona, were completed or safeguarded in these remote locations. As the scholar Don Chad-Oakute Corain so powerfully argued, these communities functioned as cultural arks, ensuring that the sophisticated Brehon law codes, the epic cycles of Irish mythology, and the intricate grammatical structures of the Gaelic language would not be lost to the violence of the age. The oral tradition, always strong among the Celts, became a vital living library. Bards and Sinchais, the traditional storytellers, committed vast swaths of genealogy and lore to memory, performing them in secret for chieftains in hidden valleys, ensuring the collective memory of the people remained intact. This period of hidden resilience, though born of desperation, ultimately saved Gaelic culture from annihilation and set the stage for its triumphant return. The Viking storm eventually subsided, giving way to trade and settlement, but the Gaelic world had not been dormant. It had been fermenting in isolation, its traditions refined and protected. When political stability slowly returned in the 11th and 12th centuries, this preserved culture burst forth with renewed vitality. The very laws, literary forms, and artistic styles that had been guarded in places like Skellig Michael became the foundation for a remarkable cultural renaissance. Gaelic influence spread back across Scotland and even into the courts of Europe, with Irish scholars being sought after for their knowledge. The hidden work of the monks and scribes ensured a continuous thread of learning that would later interweave with continental traditions, contributing to the broader intellectual awakening of the medieval period. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that the most potent rebellions are sometimes fought not with swords, but with pens, memories, and an unbreakable will to safeguard our identity against the tides of destruction. While the Gaelic clans found refuge in the misty isolation of islands and bogs, an even more astonishing feat of hidden survival was unfolding deep beneath the earth itself. The year 1453 marks one of the most pivotal moments in history, the fall of Constantinople. After a brutal siege, the great capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the jewel of Christendom for over 1,000 years, was conquered by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. The event sent a shockwave of despair across the Christian world, but for the millions of Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians living in the heart of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, it was an immediate and terrifying reality. They were now a subject people under a powerful Muslim empire, while the Ottomans were often tolerant compared to their contemporaries, granting non-Muslims a degree of self-governance as dhimmis. The pressure to convert was persistent, and the social status of Christians was significantly diminished. For many, the choice was stark: assimilate, flee, or find a way to disappear. In the unique geological landscape of Cappadocia, a third remarkable option presented itself. They went underground quite literally to protect their world from extinction. Cappadocia is a region unlike any other on Earth, a surreal panorama of soft volcanic rock sculpted by wind and water into fantastic cones, pillars, and valleys often called fairy chimneys. But its true marvel lies beneath the surface. For centuries, inhabitants had been carving homes, monasteries, and storage rooms directly into the rock. After the Ottoman conquest, these existing subterranean refuges were expanded into vast, secret, and self-sufficient cities. The most famous of these is Derinkuyu, a labyrinthine complex descending 18 levels and over 200 feet deep, capable of sheltering up to 20,000 people along with their livestock, food stores, and wine presses. The engineering was breathtaking. Massive, circular stone doors weighing half a ton each could be rolled shut from the inside to seal each level against intruders. Intricately carved ventilation shafts, some stretching over 100 feet to the surface, provided fresh air to the deepest chambers. Networks of narrow, easily defensible passageways connected living quarters, churches, stables, and even cemeteries, creating a completely hidden society that could survive for months at a time, completely cut off from the world above. Life in these sunless cities was a profound act of faith and cultural preservation. The most vital spaces were the hidden churches, their walls meticulously frescoed with scenes from the Bible and the lives of saints. In the flickering light of oil lamps, priests would conduct the divine liturgy in hushed tones, their chants echoing softly through the stone chambers, never loud enough to betray their presence to the world above. Families would gather in their rock-carved homes, whispering the old stories and passing down precious icons not as mere art, but as sacred windows to heaven, tangible connections to the faith and empire that had been lost. Historian Judith Herron emphasizes that these communities were not just hiding, they were actively maintaining a microcosm of Byzantine civilization. They preserved the complex theology, the administrative structures of the church, and the Greek language through clandestine education. In many ways, these underground networks became the last repositories of pure Byzantine culture, unsullied by the compromises often necessary for those living openly under Ottoman rule. This strategy of physical concealment ultimately allowed for a form of survival that negotiation alone could never have achieved. After the initial shock of conquest subsided, the Ottomans became aware of these hidden communities, but often found it impractical to root them out completely. Instead, a fragile, tacit understanding emerged. The underground Christians, by their very isolation, posed little threat of rebellion. In return for taxes and outward submission, they were often granted a significant degree of autonomy, allowed to govern their own affairs and practice their faith in secret. This delicate balance allowed the Greek Orthodox identity to persist in the heart of Anatolia for centuries. When the population exchanges between Greece and Turkey occurred in the early 20th century, the descendants of these cave dwellers brought their distinct customs, their Byzantine chant, and their memories of a hidden life with them, enriching the cultural fabric of modern Greece. Meanwhile, their breathtaking underground cities remain in Turkey, not just as tourist attractions but as silent monuments to the incredible lengths to which people will go to safeguard their faith, their culture, and their very identity against seemingly insurmountable odds. While some cultures sought refuge in remote mountains or hidden caves, the Jewish diaspora across medieval Europe faced a persecution so pervasive that their very survival required a different kind of concealment, one not of geography, but of identity itself. The 12th through 15th centuries marked a horrifying escalation of anti-Jewish violence and legal exclusion. Official edicts of expulsion were issued from England in 1290, from France in 1394, and most catastrophically from Spain in 1492, forcing hundreds of thousands to abandon homes they had built over generations. These were not mere relocations, they were state-sanctioned acts of cultural erasure, designed to tear apart the social and spiritual fabric of an entire people. Uprooted and perpetually unwelcome, Jewish communities were faced with an impossible choice: flee to an often unknown next destination, convert to Christianity under duress, or devise a way to live in plain sight while guarding their true selves in the deepest secrecy. Out of this crucible of suffering emerged one of history's most profound and resilient stories of clandestine rebirth. For those who chose to outwardly conform while inwardly holding fast to their faith, a complex and dangerous double life began. In Portugal, where many Spanish Jews initially found brief refuge before being forced to convert themselves, a vast community of Cristãos Novos, or New Christians, emerged. To the outside world, they were devout Catholics. Behind the thick walls of their homes, they remained observant Jews. These crypto-Jews, also known as Marranos, developed an intricate web of secret practices to avoid detection. They would clean their homes meticulously on Fridays, but light their Sabbath candles inside closed ovens or hidden basements to conceal the smoke. They would attend Mass, but then return home to pray from handwritten prayer books kept concealed behind false panels in their furniture. They maintained kosher dietary laws by devising complex systems, often purchasing live animals to slaughter according to tradition themselves, or using olive oil instead of forbidden animal fats. The fear was constant and justified, as the ever-present threat of the Inquisition loomed large. Its meticulous records, intended to document their heresy, now serve as tragic testimony to their incredible courage, detailing how families risked everything to celebrate Passover with unleavened bread made in secret, or to whisper the ancient Hebrew prayers on Yom Kippur. Language itself became a vital tool for this covert survival. As communities were scattered across continents, they developed unique coded tongues that allowed them to communicate without alerting hostile authorities. In the Ottoman Empire and throughout the Mediterranean, Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, became a linguistic sanctuary. This was essentially 15th-century Spanish, but written in the Hebrew alphabet, instantly making any document incomprehensible to Christian outsiders. It became the language of the home, of poetry, and of sacred translation, preserving a cultural world that had been physically left behind. In other parts of Europe, Yiddish, blending German dialects with Hebrew and Aramaic, served a similar purpose, creating a rich literary and oral tradition that bound widely dispersed communities together with an invisible thread of shared words and stories. This was more than just communication. It was a fortress of identity built from grammar and vocabulary, allowing a people to speak their truth in a code that only they could understand. Perhaps the most powerful and enduring act of secret resistance was the relentless clandestine pursuit of knowledge. When public synagogues and schools were banned, education moved into private homes, cellars, and back rooms. The historian Yosef Hayim Yerushalmi profoundly explored this phenomenon, emphasizing the concept of Jewish memory not as a passive recollection, but as an active, commanded duty to remember and transmit. In his work, he illustrates how this mandate fueled a secret intellectual revolution. Banned books were copied and circulated in secret. Rabbis taught small groups of children by candlelight after nightfall. The rituals of life, birth, marriage, death were imbued with hidden meanings and performed with a dual purpose: to satisfy the authorities and to fulfill sacred law. This underground network of learning ensured that halakhic law, Talmudic scholarship, and mystical traditions were not just preserved but were continually debated and advanced, even under the most oppressive conditions. This centuries-long period of hidden perseverance did not merely allow for survival, it actively fertilized the ground for a future renaissance. The intellectual rigor and adaptability honed in secrecy became powerful assets. When ghetto walls began to fall and periods of enlightenment offered new opportunities, these communities were prepared. The same dedication to study and textual analysis that had been preserved in hidden yeshivas naturally flowed into the burgeoning fields of science, medicine, and philosophy during the Enlightenment. Jewish thinkers, once forced to hide their identity, emerged as central contributors to European thought. The deep-seated value placed on memory and historical narrative provided a powerful framework for understanding their own place in history, ultimately contributing to the rich tapestry of modern Jewish life and thought. Their story stands as a monumental testament to the idea that the most powerful preservation often occurs not in remote isolation, but in the very heart of the storm, proving that a culture can maintain its flame through the silent, steadfast power of spiritual and intellectual secrecy, waiting for the moment when it can once again shine openly for the world to see. Far to the south of the Mediterranean world, along the sun-scorched southern edge of the Sahara Desert, another grand civilization was quietly succumbing to a slower, yet equally relentless form of collapse. For centuries, the empires of the West African Sahel, like Ghana and later Mali, had been legendary. Their wealth, drawn from controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes, was the stuff of European myth. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, famously destabilized the entire Egyptian economy with the sheer amount of gold he distributed on his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century. These were sophisticated, urbanized states with great cities like Timbuktu, home to a renowned university and libraries filled with thousands of manuscripts. But their greatness was built on a fragile ecological balance, one that began to shift catastrophically around the 15th and 16th centuries. A prolonged period of desertification, likely spurred by natural climate cycles and perhaps even overgrazing, began to push the Sahara southward. The life-giving rains became less reliable, the grasslands that supported the trade caravans' camels began to wither, and the very rivers that sustained agriculture started to shrink. At the same time, new maritime trade routes established by European powers along the West African coast began to bypass the ancient Saharan crossings, slowly strangling the economic heart of these land-based empires. The result was not a sudden invasion, but a slow, grinding dissolution. The central authority of Mali waned, the trade routes grew quiet, and the great urban centers, once hubs of intellectual and commercial exchange, were gradually abandoned to the encroaching sand. Faced with this creeping environmental and economic catastrophe, the people of the Sahel did not simply vanish or surrender to their changing world. They executed a brilliant and strategic retreat, fragmenting into smaller, more resilient units and seeking out pockets of refuge where life could be sustained. Some communities migrated towards the few remaining reliable water sources, like the Niger River's inland delta, a vast network of streams, lakes, and marshes that became a sanctuary for displaced cultures. Others pushed south into the more humid savannas, but one of the most remarkable strategies was adopted by groups like the Dogon people, who chose a path of dramatic isolation and concealment. They migrated to the Bandiagara escarpment, a vast geological formation of cliffs and rocky plateaus in what is now Mali. This landscape was not chosen for its fertility, but for its defensibility and its secrecy. The sheer cliff faces provided a natural fortress, difficult for outsiders or rival groups to access, while the hidden caves and crevices offered perfect places to establish villages that were virtually invisible from the plains below. This migration was a conscious decision to trade imperial grandeur for cultural survival, to become small and hidden in order to remain authentically themselves. Life on the escarpment demanded incredible ingenuity and adaptation. The Dogon became masters of harnessing their harsh environment. They developed a complex and sustainable agricultural system, carving out small, terraced gardens on the steep cliff sides where they cultivated onions, grains, and tobacco. They devised ingenious methods for storing precious water, hollowing out gourds to create cool, evaporative containers, and digging deep into the rock to find hidden aquifers. But their most profound adaptation was not agricultural, it was intellectual and spiritual. In their secluded communities, they developed and preserved an astoundingly complex cosmology, a system of knowledge so detailed and accurate that it would later stun the Western anthropologists who studied it. The French anthropologist Marcel Grioul spent decades living with the Dogon in the 1930s and 40s, and what he documented was a complete philosophical system encoded into their art, their architecture, and most importantly, their oral histories. Dogon elders revealed to him a deep understanding of astronomy, including knowledge of the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter, and the 50-year orbital cycle of Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye. This knowledge was passed down through generations in secret societies, guarded as sacred lore. This was far more than just astronomy. It was a complete framework for existence, a way of encoding survival knowledge, history, and ethical codes into a form that could be preserved without written texts that could be captured or destroyed. Their myths explain the creation of the world, the origins of agriculture, and the importance of social harmony. Their famous ceremonial masks and intricate wooden sculptures were not merely art, they were mnemonic devices, physical representations of this complex knowledge system. This clandestine preservation of a sophisticated worldview, hidden in one of the most remote places on Earth, represents a profound form of resilience. It was a way of ensuring that even if their material wealth and political power were gone, the intellectual and spiritual core of their civilization would endure, untouched by the changes sweeping the plains below. The survival strategies honed in these hidden enclaves did more than just preserve isolated cultures. they became a deep reservoir of resilience that would eventually feed back into the broader region. When the Songhai Empire later rose to power, it absorbed and was influenced by these surviving cultural elements. The traditions of governance, the artistic styles, and the spiritual concepts that were safeguarded in places like the Bandiagara escarpment and the Niger Delta became threads in the fabric of new political entities. Even today, the cultural identities of modern West African nations are deeply rooted in this period of hidden adaptation. The Dogon and other groups demonstrate that collapse is not always an end point, but can be a catalyst for a strategic return to a smaller, more sustainable scale, where the most valuable elements of a culture can be concentrated, protected, and kept alive, waiting for a new dawn. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that sometimes the best way to endure a cataclysm is not to build a higher wall, but to find a deeper, more secret place to safeguard your soul. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of collision was unfolding, one that would test the limits of human endurance against a tide of disease, conquest, and forced cultural assimilation. The arrival of European explorers in the Americas unleashed an apocalypse for the indigenous peoples of the continents. It was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, a perfect storm of foreign pathogens against which they had no immunity, combined with the relentless advance of military conquest and a fervent, often brutal, campaign of religious conversion. Entire nations were decimated. Some scholars estimate that within the first century of contact, up to 90% of the population perished from diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. This was more than a military defeat. It was a demographic and spiritual cataclysm that shattered ancient social structures and threatened to erase cultures that had flourished for millennia. In the face of this overwhelming pressure, the choice for many Native American societies became stark and clear: assimilate and vanish, or find a way to resist by disappearing from the sight of their new overlords. Their survival would depend on a profound and secretive strategy of cultural concealment. One of the most dramatic examples of this clandestine resistance erupted in the arid landscapes of the American Southwest in 1680. For over a century, the Pueblo peoples had endured the heavy hand of Spanish colonial rule. Franciscan missionaries, backed by soldiers, had systematically worked to dismantle their world, banning their religious ceremonies, destroying their sacred kivas, and publicly whipping their spiritual leaders. The Spanish encomienda system forced them into labor while their traditional economies were disrupted. The pressure cooker of oppression finally exploded in the Pueblo Revolt, a brilliantly coordinated uprising across dozens of villages that successfully drove the Spanish out of the region for 12 years. This was a stunning military victory, but when the Spanish eventually returned with a stronger force to reconquer the area, the Pueblo peoples knew they could not win a second sustained war in the open. Their strategy shifted from open rebellion to a form of deeply ingrained, secretive resistance. They did not simply surrender, they melted away, establishing new, hidden villages in remote, defensible locations like the top of Dawa Yalan or Corn Mountain, a massive mesa that provided a commanding view of the surrounding desert. These remote sanctuaries became arks for their cultural survival, places where they could live beyond the immediate and watchful eye of the Spanish authorities. Life in these secluded villages was a continuous act of cultural preservation performed in whispers and behind closed doors. Archaeologist Stephen Lexon's work has been instrumental in tracing these patterns of movement and isolation, revealing how communities intentionally positioned themselves in difficult-to-reach places to maintain autonomy. Within these hidden spaces, they safeguarded the very essence of their identity: the knowledge of dry farming, a sophisticated practice of cultivating crops like corn, beans, and squash in a parched environment with minimal water, was passed down through generations. This was not just an agricultural technique, it was a sacred covenant with the land, a set of rituals and observations that connected them to their ancestors and their cosmology. Similarly, the art of pottery making continued, with artisans subtly incorporating ancient religious symbols into the designs of pots made for Spanish households, a quiet act of rebellion where traditional spirituality was hidden in plain sight. The most vital traditions were those performed entirely away from outsiders. Ceremonial dances, the heart of Pueblo religious life, continued in sealed kivas or in remote canyon bottoms under the cover of darkness. Sacred masks and ritual objects were carefully concealed, only to be brought out for these secret gatherings. Oral histories became the living libraries of the people, with elders whispering the old stories and the complex details of their clan lineages to the young, ensuring that the memory of their past and the blueprint for their culture would not be lost. This centuries-long strategy of public compliance and private perseverance created a powerful undercurrent of cultural continuity that never broke. While outwardly adopting Catholicism, many Pueblo communities syncretized it with their own beliefs, creating a unique spiritual tapestry that allowed their ancient worldviews to endure. This hidden resilience eventually bore fruit in a very public way. In the 20th century, as federal policies toward Native Americans shifted and a new era of cultural rights emerged, the Pueblos were uniquely positioned to lead a powerful renaissance. The traditions they had guarded so fiercely for generations, their languages, their artistic styles, their ceremonial practices did not need to be rediscovered from books or archaeologists' reports. They were alive, vibrant, and practiced within the community. This provided a solid foundation for a renewed sense of identity and political agency. Their story is a profound lesson in the power of passive resistance and the incredible endurance of cultural memory. It demonstrates that sometimes the most effective way to resist total erasure is not through a single dramatic battle, but through the quiet, daily, and determined act of remembering, of practicing, and of teaching, ensuring that the heart of a culture continues to beat strongly, even when it must do so in secret for centuries. While the Roman legions marched across the lowlands of Britain, building their straight roads and imposing their laws, a different story was unfolding in the misty Highlands and rugged western coasts. The Roman conquest of Britain, beginning in 43 Common Era, was a classic tale of imperial absorption. The fertile southeast was quickly subdued and Romanized, with native Britons in these areas adopting Latin, Roman dress, and the amenities of urban life. But Roman control was always tenuous in the north and west, in the lands we now know as Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. Here, among the ancient Celtic tribes like the Ciliars in Wales and the Picts in Scotland, the legions met fierce and unyielding resistance. The Romans built massive walls like Hadrian's formidable barrier to keep these barbarians out, effectively creating a stark border between the Romanized world and the stubbornly independent Celtic fringe. It was in these untamed uplands, in the very shadow of the greatest empire the world had ever known, that a secret, centuries-long project of cultural preservation began. The Celts were not defeated. They simply retreated into a landscape the Romans found too difficult to tame, and there they guarded the flame of their ancient identity. The geography itself became their greatest ally and their fortress. In Wales, they fell back to fortified settlements high on hilltops, places like Tre Seri on the Llyn Peninsula, a massive stone-walled village perched amid the clouds, its ruins still whispering of defiance. In the Scottish Highlands, they utilized naturally defensible glens and sea locks, places where the Roman army's famed discipline and formation fighting were neutralized by the terrain. But their resistance was not merely military, it was profoundly cultural. When the public practice of their Druidic religion was brutally suppressed by the Romans, who saw it as a threat to their authority, it didn't vanish. It simply went underground, both figuratively and literally. Secret ceremonies were held in hidden groves deep within forests or in secluded caves along the coast. The transfer of sacred knowledge, once the purview of a powerful druidic class, became a more decentralized, clandestine affair, passed down within families and trusted communities away from the eyes of Roman informants. The most vital keepers of this culture were the bards, the oral historians and poets of the Celtic world. In a society where the Romans promoted literacy in Latin, the Celts doubled down on their ancient oral traditions. These bards were not mere entertainers, they were the living libraries of their people. They memorized immense volumes of material genealogies that traced chieftains back to mythical heroes, complex legal codes that governed land and kinship, and epic cycles of mythology that explained the world and their place in it. A single bard could hold in his memory the entire cultural and historical identity of a tribe. They performed these works in the halls of chieftains in those remote hill forts, their voices keeping the old stories alive for generations who had never known a Britain free of Roman roads. This oral tradition was an act of intellectual defiance. It ensured that the Celtic languages, the precursors to Welsh, Cornish, Gaelic, and Breton, continued to be spoken and evolved naturally, untouched by the Latin that was dominating commerce and administration in the lowlands. As the renowned archaeologist Barry Cunliffe has emphasized, this cultural tenacity in the western fringes was not a minor footnote but a central reason for Celtic survival. He argues that these areas acted as refugia, protected zones where language, art, and social structures could be maintained against the overwhelming pressure of Romanization. This centuries-long period of cultural stealth did more than just allow for survival. It actively stored up energy for a spectacular resurgence. When the Roman Empire began to crumble and its legions were withdrawn from Britain around 410 Common Era, they left behind a power vacuum. The Romanized Britons in the southeast were suddenly vulnerable to new invasions, notably from the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. In this chaos, the cultures that had been preserved in the uplands saw their moment. The Celtic kingdoms that had been biding their time in Wales, like Gwynedd and Powys, now emerged with a strong, intact identity, ready to resist the new Germanic invaders. Their art, their laws, and their language flowed back into the post-Roman landscape. Most famously, the stories preserved by those oral boards provided the raw material for one of the world's most enduring literary cycles, the legends of King Arthur. While a historical figure named Arthur may have been a Romano-British war leader fighting the Saxons, the myths that grew around him, the magical sword Excalibur, the wizard Merlin, the Knights of the Round Table, are steeped in the older Celtic mythology that had been guarded so carefully in the West. The Arthurian legends are a powerful fusion of the leftover Roman military ideal and the deep, mystical Celtic subconscious that had never been extinguished. The secret perseverance of the Celtic tribes demonstrates that the most powerful resistance is sometimes not a loud, dramatic battle, but a quiet, stubborn act of memory. By refusing to forget who they were, by singing their stories in hidden halls, they ensured that when the empire finally receded, their culture was not a relic to be excavated, but a living, breathing force ready to shape the world that came next. Even as the Celtic bards were safeguarding their stories in the misty Highlands of Britain, another great seafaring civilization was facing its own moment of existential crisis, responding not by retreating inland, but by scattering across the vast open sea. The great Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were not just urban centers, they were the nerve centers of the first truly global maritime trading network, their merchant ships a common sight from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the harbors of Egypt. Their wealth was legendary, built on the coveted purple dye extracted from the murex snail, and a monopoly on the trade of cedar wood, glass, and precious metals. But this very success made them a target for every rising imperial power. The Assyrian war machine, with its relentless sieges and brutal demands for tribute, began to choke their independence. Then came the defining catastrophe, the siege of Tyre by Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era. For 7 months, the island city held out, but Alexander's audacious engineering feat, building a massive causeway from the mainland to the island, sealed its fate. The city was utterly destroyed, its buildings razed, and thousands of its citizens executed or sold into slavery. For the surviving Phoenicians, the world they knew had been annihilated. Their homeland was no longer a sanctuary but a graveyard and a prize for foreign conquerors. Their response was not to surrender their identity, but to dissolve into their own greatest creation, their far-flung web of trade routes, vanishing into the Mediterranean's countless coves and islands to protect their legacy. This was not a panicked flight but a strategic diaspora, a deliberate fading into the periphery. They did not abandon their core competencies, they weaponized them for survival. The same navigational skills that had built their empire now became their tool for concealment. Their large, deep-hulled merchant ships, designed for open-water cargo runs, were supplemented by smaller, faster vessels perfect for slipping into hidden inlets and establishing clandestine anchorages. They turned to the remote, often uninhabited islands and rugged coastlines they knew intimately from centuries of trade places like the rocky shores of Sardinia, the strategic harbors of Malta, and the Atlantic-facing coast of modern-day Morocco. These were not grand, walled cities designed to impress. They were practical, often temporary, trading posts known as emporia. Situated on easily defensible promontories or small offshore islands, these outposts were chosen for their access to fresh water, their concealment from major shipping lanes, and their proximity to valuable local resources or untapped markets. Life here was austere and focused solely on continuity. The goal was not to replicate the glory of Tyre, but to create a decentralized, resilient network that could operate beneath the notice of the great empires. Within these isolated enclaves, the most vital elements of Phoenician culture were meticulously preserved and passed down. The most profound of these was their revolutionary gift to the world, the alphabetic script. Unlike the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphics of Egypt, which required years of study by a scribble class, the Phoenician alphabet was a system of 22 simple consonantal characters. It was efficient, learnable, and perfectly suited for recording transactions, etching labels on cargo, and keeping commercial records. In their hidden settlements, this script became more than a tool for commerce. It became a lifeline to their identity. It was used to mark graves with traditional symbols like the Tanit sign, and to inscribe prayers to their gods, Baal and Astarte, on small votive offerings. This portable technology of writing was their ultimate cultural ark. As archaeologist Maria Eugenia Orbit has extensively documented, these dispersed communities formed a hidden network of cultural exchange. Through these secretive trade routes, not only goods but ideas and innovations traveled. A trader from a hidden post in Sardinia might meet another from a Maltese outpost, and in their exchange they would share news, reinforce shared customs, and ensure their unique language and writing system continued to evolve and remain cohesive across thousands of miles. This clandestine, decentralized network did far more than just allow a people to survive. It set the stage for a quiet, world-altering rebirth. The most spectacular example of this is, of course, Carthage. Founded centuries earlier as a colony from Tyre, it was just one of many such outposts. But with the mother cities in the Levant crushed, the mantle of Phoenician leadership naturally passed to this powerful daughter in the west. Carthage became the new, public-facing heart of this hidden network, drawing its strength, its skilled sailors, its merchants, and its cultural confidence from the diffuse colonies scattered across the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian Empire was, in essence, the political manifestation of this secret Phoenician revival. But the influence spread even further. As the Phoenician traders from these remote posts interacted with the emerging cultures of Europe, particularly the Greeks and later the Romans, their alphabet was adopted and adapted. The Greeks added vowels, creating the script that would become the foundation of Western literature and philosophy. The Etruscans took it, and from them, the Romans developed the Latin alphabet that we still use today. Every time we write a letter, we are using a tool refined and preserved by a people who chose to become invisible in order to keep their greatest innovation alive. Their story is a masterclass in a different kind of resilience. It proves that a civilization's greatest legacy is not always its monuments or its conquered territories, but its ideas. And sometimes the best way to protect those ideas is not to fortify them in one place, but to scatter them like seeds across the water, trusting that in distant and hidden soil, they will eventually take root and grow into forests that change the world. High in the thin, rarefied air of the Himalayas, where the world's highest peaks pierce the sky, an entirely different kind of refuge was being conceptualized, one not carved from rock or hidden in a bog, but revealed through spiritual prophecy. For Tibetan Buddhists, periods of intense political upheaval and persecution were not merely historical challenges. They were cycles of darkness foretold by ancient scriptures, and against them, they held a unique and powerful map to salvation. This map did not lead to a city or a fortress, but to a Baal, a hidden valley, a sacred sanctuary believed to have been consecrated in the 8th century by the great tantric master, Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche. According to tradition, Guru Rinpoche foresaw times when the Buddha's teachings would be threatened in Tibet. In preparation, he and his consort, Yest Tsojul, journeyed throughout the Himalayas, blessing remote and inaccessible valleys, infusing them with spiritual power and concealing them from the unworthy. He then hid terma, or treasure texts, containing detailed descriptions of these valleys and the rituals to access them, to be discovered by destined treasure revealers, or terterns, when the time of need arrived. This created a profound geography of hope, a network of spiritual arcs woven into the very landscape, waiting to offer sanctuary when the world above fell into chaos. The journey to a Baal was never meant to be easy. It was a spiritual test as much as a physical relocation. It was believed that these valleys were protected by powerful guardians and could only be found by those with pure motivation and a karmic connection. The path was often described in cryptic poetry and symbolic maps within the terma texts. A lama, acting on a vision or a revealed prophecy, would lead a group of devoted followers on an arduous pilgrimage into the most remote and treacherous mountain ranges. The scholar Donald Lopez, an authority on Tibetan Buddhism, emphasizes that the concept of the Baal is central to understanding Tibetan resilience. He notes that these were not just physical places but states of mind, symbolic representations of the pure land that diligent practitioners could manifest even in the midst of suffering. The physical hardship of the journey, navigating icy passes, traversing unstable glaciers, and enduring the brutal altitude, was a form of purification, stripping away attachment to the mundane world and preparing the community for their new life as guardians of an endangered tradition. Their arrival in the valley was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of their sacred duty. Life within a Baal was a deliberate and meticulous act of preservation. These hidden valleys, such as the famed Baal Kimolong in Nepal or Baal Sikkim in the eastern Himalayas, were often astonishingly fertile and secluded, surrounded by a natural fortress of impassable peaks. Here, the community would establish a new society entirely dedicated to the Dharma. Monks and nuns would construct small, humble monasteries and meditation caves, often built into cliff faces. Within these sacred spaces, the most critical work began, the preservation of the teachings. In the flickering light of butter lamps, scribes would meticulously copy the vast Tibetan Buddhist canon, the Kangya and Tengya comprising thousands of texts on philosophy, medicine, logic, and meditation. These manuscripts, sometimes written in gold and silver ink on handmade paper derived from the poisonous Locta shrub, became priceless treasures. Meditation masters would lead small groups in extended retreats, practicing the intricate tantric visualizations and yogas that were the heart of their lineage, ensuring that the experiential knowledge, not just the intellectual theory, was passed down flawlessly to the next generation. Artisans would create thankas, detailed scroll paintings, and sculpt sacred statues, embedding within them the iconographic codes of their tradition. This entire civilization in miniature was dedicated to one purpose: keeping the flame of their culture burning with such care that not a single spark would be lost. This centuries-long strategy of spiritual secrecy, of hiding the most precious elements of a culture in the most remote corners of the earth, had profound and far-reaching consequences. When periods of persecution eventually subsided, whether after the collapse of a tyrannical king or the passing of a hostile regime, it was from these hidden valleys that the revitalizing energy emerged. Lamas and scholars who had preserved the teachings in their purest form would return to the population centers, re-establishing monasteries, restarting educational institutions, and reviving artistic traditions. The lineages that had been safeguarded in the Baal became the gold standard for authenticity, the unbroken thread connecting the present to the wisdom of the past. This pattern repeated itself numerous times throughout Tibetan history, most notably providing a framework for resilience following the Chinese invasion and the Cultural Revolution in the 20th century. Even today, the belief in Baal fuels a form of cultural and environmental conservation, as these valleys are seen not as wilderness to be conquered, but as sacred ecosystems to be protected. The story of the Himalayan hidden valleys is perhaps the ultimate expression of faith as a tool of survival. It demonstrates that the most powerful sanctuary is not one made of stone and mortar, but one built from unwavering conviction, a sacred geography of the heart that can never truly be conquered or destroyed, ensuring that a culture's spiritual core can endure even when its physical manifestations are threatened with utter oblivion. Even as Tibetan monks sought refuge in the spiritual sanctuaries of the Himalayas, another type of organization, one built on martial discipline and immense wealth, was facing a far more sudden and brutal extinction event. The story of the Knights Templar is one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune. Founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the order evolved into the world's first multinational corporation, a formidable banking and military power with chapters stretching from Jerusalem to London. Their iconic white mantles adorned with the Red Cross were symbols of faith, fearlessness, and immense financial credibility. Kings and popes borrowed from their treasury. Their network of preceptories functioned as a medieval ATM, allowing a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem. But by the early 14th century, their power had made them envy of kings and a target for a debt-ridden crown. On Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France, in coordination with Pope Clement V, launched a perfectly coordinated surprise attack. Hundreds of Templars across France were simultaneously arrested on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sodomy, charges almost certainly fabricated to justify seizing their vast wealth and eliminating a rival power structure. Under brutal torture, many knights confessed to the outrageous accusations. The order was officially dissolved by the Pope, and its last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314, famously cursing the king and Pope from the flames as he died. Publicly, the Knights Templar were finished, erased from the map in a bloody and humiliating climax. But almost immediately, the legends began. The official records showed that the king's men seized the Paris temple, the order's headquarters, and found almost nothing. The famed Templar treasure, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries, had vanished without a trace. This single, baffling fact ignited 700 years of speculation and gave birth to the enduring theory that the Templars had not been caught unaware, but had been warned, executing a brilliant plan to disappear and preserve their legacy in the deepest secrecy. Theories about their escape routes and final destinations form a sprawling tapestry of historical detective work and pure myth. One persistent legend suggests a contingent of Templar knights, perhaps with the lost treasure in tow, fled by sea from the port of La Rochelle. Some accounts have them finding refuge in Scotland, a nation then under excommunication by the Pope and therefore beyond the reach of papal orders. There, the story goes, they offered their military expertise to Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a battle the Scots won against overwhelming odds. This alleged Scottish connection is a cornerstone of many theories linking the Templars to the later development of Freemasonry, with its own complex system of symbols and secret rites. Other tales point to Switzerland, suggesting that the exiled knights formed the nucleus of the Swiss Guard and used their sophisticated banking knowledge to establish the secretive financial systems that would make the country famous. Perhaps the most fantastical theories propose that Templar ships, possessing secret navigational charts from their travels, crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus, establishing a hidden presence in the New World. Stories persist of mysterious, weathered stone towers in New England and carvings of Templar crosses on Native American artifacts, presented as evidence of their pre-Columbian arrival. While mainstream historians largely dismiss these more extravagant claims, they acknowledge a crucial truth: the sudden vacuum left by the Templars' dissolution had to be filled. Their financial operations, their international network, and their accumulated knowledge did not simply evaporate. They were absorbed, adapted, and driven underground. This is where the line between documented history and compelling legend becomes most fascinating. Historian Malcolm Barber, a preeminent scholar on the Templars, carefully separates fact from fiction. He states, "The survival of the order as a secret society after its dissolution is a myth without any foundation." He argues that the evidence shows most Templars were absorbed into other monastic orders or retired peacefully, and that their assets were formally transferred to the rival Knights Hospitaller. Yet, Barber and others also concede that the sheer scale of the Templar operation makes it likely that some local treasures and archives were successfully hidden by forewarned members before the arrests. It is this kernel of probability, the missing treasure, the lost archives, that fuels the enduring mythos. The idea of a continuous, hidden Templar lineage is powerfully seductive because it speaks to a desire for justice, a belief that such a noble and powerful institution could not have been so utterly defeated. This narrative gave rise to stories of hidden vaults beneath Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland or beneath the Paris streets, safeguarding not just gold, but sacred relics like the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, alongside heretical knowledge that threatened the Church. The true rebirth of the Templar ideal, however, may not have been in a literal continuation of the order. but in its profound influence on the emerging structures of the modern world. The Templars were pioneers of international finance, and their sudden disappearance created an expertise vacuum that was filled by Italian banking families like the Medicis, who then fueled the economic engine of the Renaissance. More intriguingly, the Templar myth became deeply woven into the fabric of European esoteric traditions. When Freemasonry emerged as a major fraternal organization in the 17th and 18th centuries, it eagerly incorporated Templar symbolism and mythology into its higher degrees. The story of the martyr Jacques de Molay and the quest to restore a lost, pure wisdom became a powerful allegory within Masonic rites. This symbolic adoption provided a narrative of ancient lineage and noble purpose. Whether any actual Templars survived to influence the Masons is historically dubious, but the idea of the Templars, a persecuted brotherhood guarding ancient secrets, became a potent cultural force. This demonstrates a different kind of survival, not of an organization itself, but of its archetype. The Templars' legacy of organizational stealth, international connection, and the protection of knowledge through symbolic codes provided a powerful blueprint for how a group can be officially dissolved, yet have its core principles and influence persist, reborn in new and unexpected forms that would go on to shape philosophy, finance, and even revolutionary politics for centuries to come. If the Black Death represented a biological fire that consumed nearly half of Europe's population, then the Italian peninsula was its very epicenter, a landscape of almost unimaginable grief and desolation. The plague arrived in Sicily in 1347, carried by Geno's trading ships from the Black Sea, and it swept through the boot of Italy with a horrifying and indiscriminate speed. By the time the worst had passed, cities like Florence and Venice had lost well over half of their citizens. The social and economic fabric unraveled overnight. Fields lay fallow for lack of laborers, workshops stood silent without their master craftsmen, and entire banking houses collapsed as debtors and creditors alike perished. The immediate response was one of sheer survival and profound spiritual crisis, with many interpreting the plague as divine punishment for a sinful world. But from this abyss of despair, a remarkable and largely hidden process of rebuilding began. It did not happen in the public squares or the decimated guild halls, but in the secluded courtyards of powerful families, the silent scriptoriums of remote monasteries, and the discreet meeting rooms of merchant bankers. This was a renaissance conducted in whispers, a clandestine effort to not just restore what was lost, but to reimagine the very foundations of society, setting the stage for the public explosion of art and learning that would later dazzle the world. The engine of this secret revival was a new, pragmatic, and often ruthless class of merchants and bankers who understood that chaos presented unparalleled opportunity. With traditional feudal structures weakened and the old aristocratic order shaken, these men operated in the shadows to construct a new economic reality. In Florence, families like the Medici, who were still decades away from their public zenith, began their ascent during this period. They built their initial fortune not on grand public displays of patronage, but on the quiet, ruthless efficiency of their banking operations. They developed sophisticated new accounting techniques like double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed them to manage risk and track complex international transactions with a clarity never before seen. Their network of agents and correspondents stretched across Europe, forming a clandestine web of finance that moved money and influenced politics far from the public eye. A loan to a struggling pope or a cash-strapped prince, negotiated in secret, could yield enormous political influence and financial returns. This behind-the-scenes financial innovation created the capital necessary to fuel everything that followed. It was a quiet revolution in how power and wealth were accumulated and deployed, setting a new template for capitalism that was born not in triumph, but in the desperate aftermath of catastrophe. Parallel to this economic restructuring, an intellectual resurrection was taking place in places far removed from the plague-ridden cities. Many of the great monastic libraries, particularly those of the Benedictine order, were located in secluded rural areas that were somewhat insulated from the worst of the pandemic. Within these hushed halls, a critical, secretive project was underway. Monks, who were among the few literate members of society, dedicated themselves to the painstaking work of preserving the classical knowledge that was teetering on the brink of being lost forever. They became the copyists and curators of antiquity, meticulously transcribing the surviving works of Greek and Roman philosophers, scientists, and poets. This was not a glamorous task celebrated in the public sphere. It was a labor of devotion and desperation, performed by men who believed they were saving the light of reason from being extinguished by an age of darkness. These handwritten codices, often beautifully illuminated, became treasure troves of forgotten ideas. They safeguarded the logic of Aristotle, the poetry of Ovid, the engineering marvels of Vitruvius, and the political theories of Cicero. This clandestine preservation effort ensured that when the world was finally ready to listen, the texts would be there, waiting to ignite the minds of a new generation. The crucial spark that would set this tinder alight was the philosophy of humanism, and its early development was often a discreet, almost private pursuit. Before it became a fashionable movement embraced by popes and princes, humanism was cultivated in the private studies and exclusive salons of wealthy scholars and merchants. These individuals, often called civic humanists, used their private wealth to become patrons of learning away from the scrutiny of a church still deeply suspicious of classical pagan ideas. They commissioned the search for lost manuscripts, funding agents to scour forgotten monastery libraries across Europe and even into the Islamic world. They employed scholars to translate these recovered Greek and Arabic texts into Latin, creating private libraries that were the envy of universities. The historian William Caffero, in his work on this period, stresses that this was a revolution from the study, arguing that the patient, scholarly work of these early humanists editing texts, comparing translations, and engaging in lively correspondence with one another, created the intellectual toolkit for the Renaissance. Their private discussions about civic virtue, the dignity of man, and the lessons of history gradually formulated a new way of seeing humanity's place in the world, one that was not solely defined by religious doctrine. This fusion of clandestine wealth and hidden knowledge created the perfect conditions for an artistic rebirth that would eventually burst into the open. The initial commissions from this new merchant class were often private and subdued. A wealthy banker might commission a small, devotional painting for his private chapel, not a grand fresco for a cathedral. A powerful family might hire an architect to discreetly redesign the interior of their palazzo to reflect the new classical ideals of proportion and harmony, creating a personal sanctuary of beauty and learning. In these private, protected spaces, artists were given the freedom to experiment. They could study the human anatomy with a new intensity, practice the techniques of linear perspective, and blend Christian themes with classical motifs without the immediate pressure of ecclesiastical approval. The early patronage of the Medici, for example, was often directed towards artists whose work embodied this new spirit but who were not yet public celebrities. They provided a safety net, allowing innovation to develop and mature in a nurturing environment before it was unveiled to a wider audience. This period of hidden experimentation was essential, allowing for the technical and philosophical mastery that would later produce the iconic works of Donatello, Brunelleschi, and eventually Michelangelo. The eventual result of all this covert activity was nothing less than the transformation of the Western world. The patient, secret work of the merchants, monks, and scholars in the decades following the Black Death did not just rebuild Italy, it repositioned it as the epicenter of a cultural earthquake whose aftershocks would ripple out for centuries. The financial systems pioneered in the back offices of Florentine banks would become the foundation of modern global finance. The recovered classical texts, painstakingly copied in quiet monasteries, would provide the intellectual foundation for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The artistic innovations perfected in private palazzos would define aesthetic ideals for generations. The Italian Renaissance, as we publicly celebrate it, was merely the flowering of a plant that had been carefully and secretly cultivated in the darkest of soils. It stands as the ultimate testament to a profound truth that echoes through all our stories of secret kingdoms, that a crisis, no matter how devastating, does not have to be an end. It can be a catalyst creating the vacuum and the necessity for a hidden rebirth, a quiet revolution of ideas that, when it finally emerges into the light, has the power to change everything. Imagine a system so paradoxical that it forcibly took children from their families and faith, only to elevate them into the most powerful positions in a vast empire, all while secretly allowing them to safeguard the very culture they were taken from. This was the essence of the Ottoman devshirme, or child levy, a practice that began in the 14th century and became one of history's most ingenious and controversial engines of statecraft. In the conquered Christian territories of the Balkans, modern-day Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Greece, Ottoman officials would periodically tour villages, selecting the most promising boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 15. The criteria were strict. They sought intelligent, strong, and healthy children, often taking just one son from each family. To the grieving parents, this was a terrifying and tragic event, a permanent loss of their child to an alien faith and a foreign ruler. The boys were taken to Istanbul, where they were formally converted to Islam, circumcised, and subjected to a rigorous and secretive process designed to strip them of their past and remold them into utterly loyal servants of the Sultan. This system, which might seem like pure cultural erasure, in fact became the mechanism for one of history's most fascinating stories of covert influence and hidden rebirth, creating a secret elite that operated from the very heart of power. The training these boys underwent was a masterpiece of psychological and intellectual engineering, designed to forge the ultimate imperial administrators and soldiers. They entered a system of palace schools, the most famous being the Enderun school within Topkapi Palace itself, where they were immersed in a demanding curriculum. They learned to speak, read, and write in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and often Persian. They studied mathematics, astronomy, theology, law, and the art of war. They were trained in courtly etiquette, calligraphy, music, and horsemanship, but the education went far beyond academics. It was a total indoctrination into a new identity. They were cut off from their families and their past, their only loyalty meant to be to the Sultan and the empire. The most physically capable were groomed for the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite infantry that became the terror of Europe. The most intellectually gifted, however, were destined for the civil service, to become bureaucrats, governors, admirals, and even the Grand Vizier, the absolute highest-ranking official in the empire, second only to the Sultan himself. This created a ruling class of unparalleled ability, but beneath the surface of absolute loyalty simmered a complex and often hidden connection to their origins. Here lies the incredible paradox of the devshirme. While the system was designed to create a class of servants with no familial or ethnic allegiances to challenge the state, it inadvertently created a hidden network of power brokers who never fully forgot where they came from. Many of these men, once they attained positions of immense influence, used their power to covertly aid their birth communities. They became powerful, secret patrons of the very cultures they were taken from. This was not an overt rebellion, but a subtle, sophisticated form of cultural infiltration and preservation. They would funnel imperial funds to build bridges, roads, and inns in their native regions, improving infrastructure under the guise of imperial development. They would endow mosques, but within their complexes, they might also secretly fund the construction of fountains, libraries, or schools that would benefit their Christian kin. They could use their influence to ensure that tax collectors in their homeland were less brutal, or that conscription quotas were less severe. In this way, the Devshirme elite became a powerful, if invisible, shield for their people, working within the system to soften the edges of Ottoman rule and ensure the survival of their native cultures. No figure exemplifies this dual allegiance more dramatically than Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, arguably the most powerful Grand Vizier in Ottoman history. Born as Bajika Sokolovic into an Orthodox Christian family in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina, he was taken in the Devshirme and rose through the ranks with astonishing speed due to his brilliance and administrative genius. For 15 years, from 1565 to 1579, he effectively ran the vast Ottoman Empire for Sultans Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim II, and Murad III, overseeing a period of great military expansion and architectural grandeur. Publicly, he was the epitome of Ottoman power, a Muslim statesman who commanded armies and navies that threatened all of Europe, but privately, he never severed his deep connection to his Serbian roots. In a stunning act of covert cultural patronage, he orchestrated the restoration of the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate of Pec, which had been abolished by the Ottomans decades earlier. He ensured that his own brother, Makarij Sokolovic, was installed as the new patriarch, effectively placing the leadership of the entire Serbian Orthodox Church within his own family. He endowed monasteries throughout Serbia and Bosnia, protecting a vital center of Slavic literacy and identity. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha was, in effect, a Serbian national hero operating from the highest office of the empire that had conquered his homeland. His story is the ultimate testament to how the Devshirme system could be subverted from within, creating a channel for cultural and religious preservation that would have been impossible through open resistance. The historian Gabor Agostin, a leading expert on the Ottoman Empire, provides crucial insight into this phenomenon. He explains that the Devshirme system was, in its own ruthless way, a remarkably effective tool for integration and meritocracy. It co-opted the most talented individuals from conquered populations, channeling their ambition into the service of the state and preventing the rise of a hereditary nobility that could challenge the Sultan. But as Agostin and others note, this integration was never total. The system created a hidden elite whose members often maintained a dual identity. They were loyal Ottomans, but they also possessed an ingrained understanding of their native cultures, which they could never fully erase. This unique position allowed them to act as cultural and political intermediaries, often understanding the concerns of the empire's Christian subjects better than any ethnic Turk could. They became the human bridges between the conqueror and the conquered, and in doing so, they ensured a measure of stability and continuity for their people that pure military domination could never have achieved. The legacy of this system is a profound lesson in the complexities of power and identity. The Devshirme did not lead to a dramatic public rebirth of a fallen Christian kingdom in the Balkans. Instead, it facilitated a quiet, sustained, and deeply influential form of cultural survival through the strategy of infiltration. By placing their sons in the very heart of the imperial machine, Christian communities found a way to exert influence and secure protection for centuries. This was not a rebellion that sought to topple the empire from without, but a subtle reshaping of it from within. It demonstrates that sometimes the most effective way to ensure your culture's survival is not to fight the power structure head-on, but to master its rules, ascend to its highest levels, and then, from that position of ultimate authority, quietly steer its resources and policies to safeguard the very world it sought to absorb. The Devastation elites became the guardians of their own people's memory, proving that even the most systematic tools of assimilation can be turned into instruments of secret resilience. While the Ottoman Empire was creating its own paradoxical class of hidden elites, an entirely different and far more raucous experiment in secret self-governance was brewing on the other side of the world, in the sun-drenched, treacherous waters of the Caribbean. The early 18th century was a unique moment of imperial weakness, often called the Golden Age of piracy, but that romantic label obscures a far more fascinating reality. This period was not defined by mere lawlessness. It was a brief, brilliant, and deliberately hidden attempt to build a new kind of society from the wreckage of colonial failure. With the War of the Spanish Succession ending in 1713, the great European powers drastically reduced their navies, dumping thousands of seasoned, unemployed sailors onto the docks of port cities from London to Port Royal. At the same time, the Spanish Empire's grip on the Caribbean was weakening, creating a power vacuum in a region crisscrossed by treasure fleets and merchant ships. For these desperate and disenfranchised men, and remarkably women, the choice was stark: a life of poverty and brutal discipline aboard a naval or merchant vessel, or a staggering gamble on freedom. They chose to vanish into the maze of islands and inlets, transforming remote havens like Nassau in the Bahamas and Tortuga off the coast of Hispaniola into something utterly unprecedented: hidden republics of pirates, functioning democracies operating in the shadows of empires. These were not just random gatherings of criminals. They were meticulously organized micro-societies with their own constitutions, economies, and strict codes of conduct, all designed to operate completely outside the control of any state. When a pirate crew captured a ship, they didn't just plunder it and sail away. They held a formal meeting, a council, where every single man, from the most grizzled gunner to the lowliest deckhand, had an equal vote on all major decisions. Should they attack that Spanish galleon? Where should they sail next? Who should be their captain for this next voyage? This radical democracy was a direct and conscious rejection of the tyrannical hierarchy they had all experienced in the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine, where captains ruled with absolute power and the lash was the primary tool of discipline. Their captain, elected by the crew, held authority only during the heat of battle. At all other times, he was just another member of the crew, subject to the same rules as everyone else. This system was codified in written articles that every pirate signed or made their mark upon before a voyage began. These articles, as recorded in primary sources like Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 book A General History of the Pirates, were extraordinary documents. They laid out in precise detail a system of social insurance that was centuries ahead of its time. Compensation was guaranteed for injured crew members, so many pieces of eight for the loss of a right arm, a different sum for the loss of a left, a specific payment for the loss of an eye or a finger. This ensured that a man maimed in the service of the crew would not simply be discarded into destitution. The economy of these hidden republics was a sophisticated and self-sustaining shadow system. Nassau, in its heyday, was a pirate capital with a functioning economy entirely separate from the colonial world. Pirates didn't just hoard their loot, they spent it. Local merchants in Nassau and in other less official ports knew that accepting Spanish silver or trade goods from pirates was far more profitable than waiting for legitimate shipments from Europe. A vibrant black market emerged, providing pirates with everything from fresh food and clean water to new sails, ammunition, and repairs for their ships. This created a symbiotic relationship between the pirates and the local community, who often saw them not as terrifying outlaws, but as the best customers in town. This influx of capital, circulated outside imperial tax systems and trade laws, made Nassau a thriving, if illicit, economic hub. Furthermore, the pirate ships themselves were models of a different kind of economics. The plunder was not seized by the captain and his officers. It was divided according to a strict, pre-agreed formula articulated in their articles. The captain might receive only 2 or 3 shares to an ordinary sailor's one, a far cry from the vast disparities of wealth they were used to. This equitable distribution of risk and reward was a powerful motivator and a radical departure from the economic norms of the day. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of these floating republics was their stunning multiculturalism and social mobility. In an age when European colonies were building rigid racial hierarchies and enforcing brutal slavery, pirate crews were remarkable islands of relative tolerance. The historian Marcus Redicker, in his seminal work Villains of All Nations, paints a vivid picture of these crews as some of the most democratic and integrated organizations in the Atlantic world. They were often a motley collection of escaped enslaved Africans, indentured servants who had fled their masters, Native Americans, and poor men from every corner of Europe. What mattered was not a man's origin, but his skill and his willingness to abide by the ship's articles. Black sailors, both free and escaped from bondage, could be found serving as equal members of the crew, and in some documented cases, even as elected captains or quartermasters. This was a level of racial integration and equality that was simply unthinkable anywhere else in the early 18th century Atlantic. For many, a pirate ship was not just a vessel for plunder, it was a vessel of liberation, offering a chance at a life of autonomy and dignity that was denied to them by the mainstream world. The physical existence of these republics was as fleeting as it was brilliant. By 1718, the British Empire had had enough. King George I appointed Captain Woodes Rogers as the new royal governor of the Bahamas, sending him with a fleet and a pardon to break Nassau's power. His famous proclamation offered pirates a chance to surrender and receive a royal pardon, or to be hunted down without mercy. The phrase often attributed to him, "They have departed from their sins," or "I have departed from them," perfectly captures the end of the experiment. Some pirates accepted the pardon and faded into obscurity. The most famous holdouts, like the legendary Blackbeard, were killed in dramatic and violent confrontations. By the 1720s, the organized pirate republics had been crushed by resurgent imperial navies, but their legacy did not die with them. Their story, amplified by books like Johnson's, captured the imagination of Europe. They became folk heroes to the impoverished masses, symbols of resistance against the oppressive power of kings, merchants, and ship owners. Their model of democratic governance, social contract, and equitable distribution of wealth provided a powerful, real-world example that would later be cited by Enlightenment thinkers and radical philosophers. They proved that even in the wake of collapse and on the margins of empire, human beings could and would experiment with radical new forms of liberty and community. The pirate republics were a flash in the pan, a few brief years of audacious freedom, but they left behind an indelible mark on our collective consciousness, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most daring ideas for a better society are first tested not in grand capitals, but in hidden harbors by those who have nothing left to lose. While the pirate republics of the Caribbean were testing radical democracy on the high seas, an entirely different form of clandestine resistance was taking shape deep within the villages and farmlands of China. one where spiritual hope was the most potent weapon against oppression. For the vast peasant population of China, the collapse of a dynasty was not an abstract political event. It was a descent into a world of unbearable hardship. The fall of the mighty Mongol Yuan dynasty in the 14th century, and later the tumultuous rise of the foreign Manchu Qing dynasty in the 17th century, brought with them widespread famine, crippling taxes, and the brutal reality of alien rule. In these times of profound suffering and chaos, when hope seemed like a distant memory, people turned not to kings or generals, but to secret societies that promised salvation and a return to a righteous cosmic order. The most enduring and influential of these was the White Lotus Society, a clandestine network that wove together Buddhist piety, folk mysticism, and a powerful vision of a future paradise into a potent force for spiritual and political preservation. The genius of the White Lotus Society lay in its structure, a decentralized and cellular organization that was virtually invisible to the authorities until it was too late. Unlike a formal rebellion with armies and banners, the White Lotus operated through a hidden web of local cells, often based around a single village or a charismatic spiritual teacher. Meetings were held in absolute secrecy, often under the cover of night in remote temples, private homes, or even in caves outside the village. To the uninitiated, these gatherings might appear as simple Buddhist prayer sessions, but they were, in fact, crucial nodes in a vast resistance network. The society used a complex system of coded phrases, secret handshakes, and symbolic gestures to identify members and convey messages without alerting imperial spies. This operational secrecy was their shield, allowing them to spread their message and organize across a huge geographical area while remaining undetected by the King State's formidable bureaucracy. Their texts were another masterpiece of clandestine communication. Scriptures and prophecies were often written in a coded language, blending Buddhist terminology with esoteric symbolism that was meaningless to outsiders but deeply inspirational to believers. These texts were copied by hand and passed from teacher to student, creating an underground literary tradition that preserved the society's core beliefs across generations without ever appearing on an official bookseller's stall. At the heart of this belief system was a powerful millenarian vision, a prophecy that promised the imminent end of the current age of suffering and the arrival of a new epoch of peace and bliss, the advent of the Buddha Maitreya. This was not a passive hope, it was a call to action. The White Lotus taught that the corrupt present world, characterized by foreign rule and injustice, was in its final days. A great cataclysm would cleanse the earth, and this would be followed by the return of the Buddha Maitreya, who would establish a pure land on earth, a utopian kingdom where there would be no more suffering, hunger, or oppression. For a peasant struggling under the weight of Manchu taxes and watching their children starve, this was an electrifying and transformative idea. It recast their suffering not as a meaningless burden, but as a necessary prelude to a glorious future that they themselves could help bring about. This millenarian fervor provided a framework for understanding their pain and a divine mandate for resistance, transforming despair into a powerful, motivating force. As the esteemed scholar Susan Naquin articulated in her seminal work on these movements, these societies offered more than just rebellion. They provided a complete culture for the disaffected. They gave peasants a structured community, a sense of purpose, and a profound hope that their actions had cosmic significance. In a world where the Confucian state had failed them, the White Lotus provided an alternative social and spiritual structure that affirmed their worth and their power to change destiny. This potent combination of secret organization and millenarian belief made the White Lotus and societies like it a persistent and volatile force in Chinese history, capable of sparking massive rebellions that shook empires to their core. Their clandestine nature meant they could lay dormant for years, even decades, quietly building their networks and waiting for the right moment. That moment often came during periods of extreme crisis, a natural disaster, a dramatic economic downturn, or a sudden weakening of central authority. Then the hidden network would spring into action. Preachers would travel from village to village, interpreting recent floods or famines as the promised cataclysm, a sign that the time for the great uprising had finally arrived. The White Lotus Rebellion from 1796 to 1804 was one such colossal eruption. It began as a tax protest in the harsh, mountainous region where Hubei, Shaanxi, and Sichuan provinces meet, but quickly exploded into a full-scale civil war fueled by White Lotus ideology. The rebellion dragged on for nearly a decade, costing the Qing treasury the equivalent of over 150 million ounces of silver and severely weakening the dynasty, planting the seeds for its eventual collapse a century later. Even when these massive uprisings were ultimately crushed by the overwhelming force of the state, they were never total failures. The ideas they championed, the vision of a just world, the right to resist oppressive authority, seeped back into the population, preserved once more in secrecy until the next cycle of crisis and hope. The activities of these secret societies demonstrated that resistance is not always a matter of Chinese letter, 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 but can be a patient, spiritual, and deeply cultural process. By safeguarding our alternative vision of the world and maintaining the social bonds to sustain it, they ensured that even in the darkest times, the embers of hope and the blueprint for a different future were never fully extinguished, waiting only for the right moment to flare up once again and illuminate the path toward renewal. While the pirate republics flourished on the high seas and the White Lotus fermented rebellion in the Chinese countryside, a far more scholarly, yet no less determined, form of resistance was taking root in the rugged mountains of Korea. The Joseon dynasty, which ruled the peninsula for over 5 centuries, was a state built on the profound principles of Neo-Confucianism, a philosophy that emphasized scholarship, moral integrity, and loyal service to the king. For the educated elite, the Yongban scholar class, this was more than a political system. It was the entire moral and intellectual framework of their civilization. But this world of orderly principle was frequently shattered by external invasions and internal factional purges that threatened to destroy the very heart of Korean learning. When the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his devastating invasions in the 1590s, his armies targeted Korea's cultural infrastructure with brutal precision. Palaces and government archives were burned, and perhaps most catastrophically, the precious woodblock printing blocks used to produce the dynasty's great literary and historical works were systematically destroyed, an attempt to erase the nation's memory. Later, during periods of intense political repression, scholars who found themselves on the losing side of a court intrigue faced exile, execution, and the eradication of their school of thought. It was in response to these existential threats to their intellectual heritage that Korea's scholars made a strategic decision. If the centers of power could not protect their knowledge, they would remove it to places of natural strength, establishing a network of hidden academies where the flame of learning could be kept safe from the fires of war and the whims of tyrants. These sanctuaries of scholarship were known as Seoan, and their placement was a masterpiece of strategic concealment. Rejecting the vulnerable plains where official government schools operated, the founders of the Seoan sought out remote mountain valleys, sites chosen not for convenience but for their defensibility, their natural beauty, and their spiritual seclusion. A typical Seoan was a modest complex of wooden buildings nestled against a mountainside, often surrounded by ancient pine trees and near a source of fresh, flowing water. The architecture itself was designed for contemplation and resilience, not for show. The journey to reach these academies was itself a rite of passage, a physical and mental separation from the mundane troubles of the world below. This geographical isolation was their primary defense, far from the marching routes of invading armies and the prying eyes of political opponents. These mountain retreats became arks for Korea's intellectual tradition. Within their quiet lecture halls and libraries, the core curriculum of Neo-Confucian thought was preserved and taught with a purity often absent from the politicized atmosphere of the capital. Students and masters alike lived a Spartan existence, their lives dedicated to the study of the classics, to philosophical debate, and to the cultivation of moral character. This was not an education for career advancement. It was a sacred trust, a commitment to safeguarding a way of life that was under constant threat of being extinguished. The most revolutionary act of preservation undertaken in these mountain academies was their fierce protection and promotion of Hangul, the unique Korean alphabet. Before its creation in the 15th century, Korean was written using complex Chinese characters, a system so difficult that it limited literacy to a tiny elite of male scholars. King Sejong the Great, in a visionary act, commissioned the creation of Hangul, a phonetic alphabet scientifically designed to be so simple that a wise man could learn it in a morning and a fool could learn it in 10 days. Despite its genius, the Yongbin elite often scorned it as a vulgar script for women and commoners, fearing it would undermine the prestige of classical Chinese learning. However, the scholars in the Seoan, particularly those from the losing political factions, recognized its incredible power. They understood that a nation's true resilience lies in the literacy and cultural cohesion of its entire people, not just its ruling class. Within the safety of their hidden academies, they began to use Hangul for a daring purpose, to translate the great Chinese Confucian classics and to write original philosophical commentaries in the Korean language. This was a quietly radical act. It democratized knowledge, making the foundational texts of their civilization accessible to anyone who could learn the alphabet, not just those who had spent decades mastering Chinese characters. As the historian Yohyun Kim Habaush has powerfully argued, this clandestine use of Hangul in the Seoan was instrumental in fostering a vernacularization of Confucian discourse. It allowed Korean scholars to internalize, critique, and ultimately reinvent Confucian thought, creating a distinctly Korean intellectual tradition that was more agile and deeply rooted in the native soil of the peninsula. The impact of this secret intellectual network on Korea's long-term resilience cannot be overstated. The Seoan did more than just hide knowledge. They actively curated and advanced it, ensuring that the Joseon dynasty's intellectual life never became stagnant or wholly dependent on the unstable politics of the royal court. When a period of repression would end or a foreign invader would withdraw, the scholars from these mountain academies would descend, bringing with them the preserved texts, the refined ideas, and the morally upright graduates needed to rebuild the nation's bureaucracy and cultural institutions. They provided a continuous thread of intellectual and ethical continuity that survived every dynastic crisis. This hidden system of education created a deep reservoir of talent and principle that the state could draw upon in times of recovery. The Seoan ensured that even when the capital was in chaos, the blueprint for a civilized society remained intact, stored safely in the minds of scholars and the libraries of the mountains. This model of decentralized knowledge preservation, of building intellectual redundancy far from the centers of power, is a big part of why Korea, despite numerous invasions and immense suffering, managed to maintain a continuous and vibrant cultural identity for millennia. The story of the Sioan is a powerful testament to the idea that a nation's most vital asset is not its army or its treasury, but its knowledge. And sometimes the most effective way to protect that knowledge is not to lock it away in a vault in the capital, but to scatter it into the hills, to entrust it to teachers and students in hidden valleys, ensuring that the light of learning will never be snuffed out, no matter how dark the times may become. Amid the brutal reality of plantation slavery in the Americas, a powerful and defiant act of secret rebuilding was taking shape in the most unforgiving landscapes imaginable. From the dense, steamy jungles of Brazil to the rugged, mountainous interiors of Jamaica, enslaved Africans were executing daring escapes, vanishing into the wilderness to forge their own free societies right under the noses of their oppressors. These were not just random bands of runaways, they were the architects of the Maroon communities, a name derived from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. Theirs was a rebellion of disappearance, a strategic retreat into geographical isolation that allowed them to construct fully functioning, self-sufficient kingdoms in the shadows. These hidden societies became beacons of hope and formidable symbols of resistance, proving that even under the most dehumanizing system ever devised, the drive for freedom and self-determination could not be extinguished. They built their own worlds from the ground up, governed by their own laws, sustained by their own hands, and fiercely defended by their own warriors. The establishment of a Maroon settlement was a feat of incredible ingenuity and survival skill. Escaping the plantation was only the first perilous step. To evade the bloodhounds and armed hunting parties that would inevitably pursue them, escapees had to master the art of becoming invisible. They would wade through streams to throw off their scent, travel only under the cover of darkness, and use the complex language of the forest to navigate. The locations they chose for their communities were deliberately remote and easily defensible. In Jamaica, they fled to the impenetrable cockpit country, a dramatic limestone terrain of steep-sided hills and deep valleys known as cockpits, which provided natural fortresses. In Suriname, they vanished into the vast, trackless Amazon rainforest, building their villages along remote river tributaries. In Brazil, they established themselves in the rugged hinterlands of the northeastern region. Life in these enclaves was a constant exercise in resilience and adaptation. They quickly developed sophisticated agricultural systems, cultivating hidden gardens of cassava, yams, and plantains, and mastering the art of hunting and trapping in their new environment. They repurposed stolen tools and metal, forging them into weapons and farming implements. Their villages, often consisting of thatched roof dwellings arranged around a central common area, were designed to be easily dismantled and moved if discovered, a testament to their perpetual state of vigilant readiness. Perhaps the most stunning achievement of the Maroons was their development of complex political and social structures, effectively creating independent nations within the colonies. These were not anarchic camps but highly organized societies with their own systems of governance, often blending political and military leadership. In the Jamaican Maroon towns, a leader known as the Colonel would be elected for his wisdom and courage, advised by a council of captains. They established strict legal codes with clear rules and punishments for crimes, and developed intricate spiritual practices that seamlessly wove together various African religious traditions, creating a powerful new syncretic faith that served as a cornerstone of their identity and resistance. This cultural preservation was absolutely vital. In the words of the renowned anthropologist Richard Price, who has spent decades studying Maroon societies, these communities were the first Africans in the Americas to successfully wrest themselves from plantation slavery and to reconstitute, in new and innovative forms, their African heritage. Through oral histories, music, dance, and ritual, they kept the memory of their ancestral homelands alive. They maintained West African languages, weaving them into the Creole tongues they developed, and preserved culinary traditions, medicinal knowledge, and artistic expressions that directly linked them to a past that slavery sought to erase. The most legendary of these hidden kingdoms was Palmares in Brazil, a sprawling federation of Maroon settlements known as quilombos that endured for most of the 17th century. At its peak, historians believe Palmares may have been home to over 20,000 people, making it larger than contemporary Rio de Janeiro. It was a fully functioning state with a diversified economy based on agriculture, metalworking, and trade with sympathetic outsiders. For decades, it withstood repeated military expeditions sent by the Dutch and Portuguese authorities, who viewed this bastion of freedom as an existential threat to the entire colonial slave-based economy. The soul of Palmares' resistance was its greatest leader, Zumbi dos Palmares. Born free in Palmares itself, Zumbi was captured by the Portuguese as a child and raised by a priest who taught him Latin and Portuguese. Despite this upbringing, Zumbi escaped at the age of 15 and returned to the Quilombo, rising through the ranks to become its military and political leader. He was a brilliant strategist, leading his warriors in devastating guerrilla attacks against plantations to free more enslaved people and secure supplies, and orchestrating the defense of Palmares' fortified settlements. His leadership and the enduring power of the community he represented became a powerful symbol, demonstrating that a free black society could not only exist but thrive and defend itself against a European power. Though Palmares finally fell after a prolonged siege in 1694, and Zumbi was captured and beheaded, his legacy was immortalized. He became a permanent icon of black resistance in Brazil, and his story spread through the slave quarters of the Americas, fueling the dreams of millions that liberation was possible. The impact of the Maroons extended far beyond their hidden villages. They fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Americas through a potent combination of military might and diplomatic cunning. Their persistent raids on plantations to acquire weapons, tools, and new recruits, and their mastery of guerrilla warfare made them a constant and expensive thorn in the side of the colonial powers. So formidable were they that European governments were repeatedly forced to do the unthinkable, negotiate with them as sovereign entities. In Jamaica, after decades of failed campaigns to subdue them, the British signed formal treaties with the Leeward and Windward Maroons in 1739. These treaties granted the Maroons their freedom, gave them communal land rights, and granted them a significant degree of self-governance in exchange for agreeing to stop accepting new runaways and to aid the colonial militia in suppressing future slave revolts, a deeply controversial clause that creates a complex legacy. In Suriname, the Saramaka Maroons also fought the Dutch to a standstill, resulting in a peace treaty in 1762 that recognized their territorial sovereignty. These treaties were extraordinary. They were, as Richard Price notes, among the first occasions where European powers were compelled to acknowledge the humanity and autonomy of people of African descent in the New World, treating them not as property but as political actors to be bargained with. This direct challenge to the ideological foundation of slavery provided a powerful, tangible precedent for abolitionists, proving that enslaved people were not passive victims but active agents of their own liberation. The very existence of these free black societies, living independently and successfully, became a potent argument against the racist justification for slavery, fueling the moral and political movements that would eventually work toward its abolition. The Maroons did not just escape and hide. They fought, they negotiated, and they won concessions that shook the very foundations of the colonial system, leaving an indelible mark on the struggle for freedom across the hemisphere. Imagine the very concept of a nation being systematically dismantled, its name scrubbed from maps, its language banned from schools, and its existence denied by the world's most powerful empires. This was the stark reality for Poland for over a century, carved up and consumed by Prussia, Russia, and Austria in a series of partitions that began in 1772. Then, just as it regained its independence after World War I, it was brutally erased again, invaded and torn apart by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. For the Polish people, this was not merely a military occupation. It was a concerted campaign of cultural and physical annihilation designed to extinguish their identity forever. Yet, in the face of this existential threat, they performed one of the most astonishing acts of collective defiance in modern history. They did not just form a resistance movement, they built an entire invisible republic, a fully functioning secret state that operated in the shadows, a testament to the unbreakable will of a people who refused to vanish. This was the Polish underground state, a breathtaking experiment in national resilience that proved a country could live on not in territory but in the spirit and organization of its citizens. The scale and complexity of this clandestine operation were unprecedented. From the moment the last Polish soldiers laid down their arms in October 1939, the framework for this hidden state began to coalesce. It was not a scattered collection of rebel cells, but a deeply integrated, parallel society with its own elaborate structure. At its heart was a government in exile based first in France and later in London, but its true genius lay in its delegate's office inside Poland itself, a secret civilian administration that reported to the exiled leaders. This underground government was organized into departments that mirrored a legitimate state. There was a directorate of civil resistance, a directorate of underground education, and even a clandestine judiciary system that tried and sentenced Nazi collaborators and traitors. Perhaps its most famous arm was its military wing, the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, which grew to become one of the largest underground resistance forces of the entire war, ultimately numbering well over 300,000 sworn members. This was not a ragtag militia. It was a disciplined army that answered to a civilian government, upholding the Polish constitution and maintaining the legal continuity of the state, even as the country itself was buried under a double occupation. They operated a sophisticated courier network that moved messages and people across fortified borders, ran clandestine printing presses that produced over 1,000 underground newspapers, and even managed a covert welfare system to aid the families of those imprisoned or killed. This was a society that had chosen to go completely underground, its every function a deliberate act of rebellion against the notion that Poland had ceased to exist. Preserving the nation's cultural and intellectual soul was seen as just as vital as military action. The Nazis, in particular, implemented a policy of cultural genocide in the part of Poland they controlled. Universities were shut down, museums were looted, and possessing a Polish-language book outside of a sanctioned German-approved library could mean deportation or execution. The goal was clear: to reduce the Polish people to a class of uneducated slaves. The underground state's response was a defiant and comprehensive system of secret education. A network of underground universities and secondary schools was established, operating in private apartments, church basements, and forest clearings. Renowned professors, risking their lives, taught courses in law, medicine, and the humanities to small groups of students who would memorize lectures, as the possession of notes was too dangerous. By 1944, it is estimated that these secret classes involved over 1 million students at various levels. This was more than an attempt to continue schooling. It was a powerful act of spiritual resistance. It ensured that the next generation of doctors, lawyers, and leaders would be trained, that the Polish language would be studied and refined, and that the intellectual heartbeat of the nation would continue to pulse strong and steady beneath the oppressive silence imposed by the occupiers. This commitment to knowledge was a declaration that while they could steal their land and murder their people, they could not kill their future. The ultimate expression of this defiance, a story that seems to transcend the very limits of human courage, is that of Witold Pilecki. In 1940, as horrific rumors began to circulate about a new camp called Auschwitz, the Polish underground needed to know what was happening inside. Most would have considered this an impossible task. Pilecki, a cavalry officer and resistance member, volunteered for the unimaginable. He deliberately walked into a German street roundup in Warsaw, was captured, and was transported to Auschwitz as prisoner number 4859. For the next 2.5 years, Pilecki lived in the heart of hell. His mission was to organize a resistance network inside the camp, gather intelligence on the atrocities being committed, and prepare the ground for a potential uprising. Under the constant threat of discovery and immediate execution, he built a clandestine military union among the prisoners, smuggling out detailed reports on the camp's operation, the mass murder taking place, and the development of the gas chambers. His reports, known as the Witold's reports, were among the very first comprehensive intelligence on the Holocaust to reach the Western Allies, a desperate plea for the world to act. After a dramatic escape from the camp in 1943, he authored a final report that stated with chilling clarity, "We have surpassed the limits of human endurance." Pilecki's mission stands as perhaps the most extreme example of the Polish underground state's reach and determination, a willingness to sacrifice everything to bear witness and resist, even from within the epicenter of evil itself. The eminent historian Norman Davies has argued that this vast, hidden infrastructure was the single most important factor in Poland's ability to survive not just the war, but the decades of communist oppression that followed. He noted that the underground state created a societal glue and a blueprint for resistance that never faded. When the war ended, Poland did not truly find liberation. It simply exchanged one occupier for another, falling under the domination of the Soviet Union. The Home Army soldiers and the civilian leaders of the secret state were hunted, imprisoned, and executed by the new communist regime, which saw them as a threat to its control. Yet the spirit and the models of organization they had perfected did not die. They went dormant, buried deep within the psyche of the nation. The practices of clandestine publishing resurfaced in the 1970s and 80s with the massive underground Samizdat press that circulated forbidden books and newspapers. The network of trust and quiet opposition evolved into the Solidarity trade union movement, which would eventually help topple the communist government in 1989. The Polish underground state demonstrated that resilience is not a momentary act of bravery, but a deep, structural capacity built on organization, education, and an unwavering belief in one's own identity. It offers a timeless lesson to the world that a nation is not merely lines on a map or a government in a capital city. A nation is its people, their shared memory, and their unbreakable will to remain who they are, no matter how deep they must go to protect it. They proved that even when a country is politically erased, it can continue to live, breathe, and resist in the shadows, waiting for its next dawn. For the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, the arrival of British colonizers in 1788 was not an encounter but an invasion, the beginning of a relentless campaign of dispossession and cultural erasure that would last for centuries. The doctrine of terra nullius, the legal fiction that the land belonged to no one, was used to justify the seizure of ancestral homelands. children were forcibly removed from their families in what became known as the Stolen Generations, a policy designed to systematically dismantle cultural continuity. Sacred languages were banned, spiritual ceremonies were outlawed, and the profound, ancient connection between people and their country was violently severed. In the face of this overwhelming pressure, which aimed not just to conquer but to eliminate, Indigenous Australians were confronted with a stark choice: assimilate and disappear, or find ingenious, often invisible, ways to safeguard their world. Their survival would depend on a profound and deeply nuanced strategy of cultural concealment, a quiet, persistent act of remembering that would keep the embers of identity glowing through the long night of oppression. This resistance took two primary forms: a geographical retreat and ingenious adaptation within plain sight. In the remote, rugged regions of the continent, the vast deserts of the Central Australia, the dense tropical rainforests of Cape York, and the isolated islands of the Torres Strait, many communities were able to maintain a degree of separation from the frontier of colonization. In these places, the old ways could continue with less direct interference, but even in areas where people were forced onto missions and government settlements under the control of churches and officials, the work of preservation did not stop, it simply changed its methods. It became a culture of whispers and subtle signs. Elders would take children out into the bush for hunting trips, which were in fact covert lessons on country, teaching them about sacred sites, plant medicine, and animal tracks, all under the guise of a simple excursion. The intricate patterns and symbols woven into baskets and painted on bodies, which held deep spiritual significance, were often explained to missionaries as mere decoration, a way to hide profound cosmological knowledge in the open. This was not a surrender of culture, but its strategic camouflage, ensuring its survival by making it appear harmless or unimportant to the eyes of the oppressor. One of the most powerful and enduring acts of this clandestine preservation is found in the rock art of Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. For tens of thousands of years, this region has been one of the great galleries of human history. But the art did not stop with colonization, it adapted. Anthropologists like Howard Morphy have documented how Aboriginal artists began incorporating new subject matter into their traditional styles. They painted magnificent, detailed images of 19th-century trading ships known as Macassan praus, and later of European settlers with their guns, horses, and pipes. To an untrained eye, these might seem like simple records of contact, but within the cultural context, they were far more. They were a way of documenting this new, traumatic reality and assimilating it into their existing framework of the world, a process of making the unknown known through the familiar medium of ancestral art. Even more remarkably, in some areas, artists continue to paint the sacred, secret designs associated with their clans' dreaming stories in hidden rock shelters, far from mission settlements. These sites became underground libraries where the most sacred knowledge was physically preserved on stone walls, waiting for a time when it could be safely taught to the next generation. This ongoing artistic tradition became a silent, unbroken thread connecting the deep past to the tumultuous present. Parallel to this was the covert circulation of cultural objects. Items of profound spiritual significance, such as carved Tijoringa or Choringa stones from Central Australia, were used in secret ceremonies and then carefully hidden from authorities who sought to confiscate and destroy them as pagan idols. There are accounts of communities creating decoys, less sacred objects to hand over if discovered, while the true vessels of spiritual power were kept safe in secret caches known only to a few senior lawmen. This underground trade in knowledge and objects was not about commerce but about continuity. A message stick might be passed between communities, its carved symbols carrying news and instructions for ceremonies that had to be held away from the patrols. Songs, which in Aboriginal culture are literally maps of the land and archives of history, were sung softly, their lyrics sometimes altered to conceal their true meaning from eavesdropping settlers, yet preserving the melody and rhythm that held the knowledge intact. These acts of covert preservation were a collective, silent pact across generations, a determined effort to ensure that no matter what was taken from them physically, the spiritual and intellectual core of their identity would remain unbroken. The decades of patient, secret resistance finally began to bear very public fruit in the mid-20th century, blossoming into a powerful cultural and political renaissance. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of the land rights movement, where Aboriginal people began to legally contest the theft of their country. In this struggle, the very knowledge that had been kept hidden became their most powerful evidence in court. Elders were able to stand before white judges and recite, from memory, the sacred songs and stories that mapped the boundaries of their ancestral estates, demonstrating a continuous connection to land that had been maintained despite every effort to break it. The hidden rock art sites were presented not as primitive curiosities, but as title deeds dating back millennia. The anthropologist Howard Morphy has argued that this was the ultimate validation of the secret keeper's work. The cultural knowledge preserved at great risk was now the key to legal recognition and the return of stolen lands. This period also saw an explosion of indigenous art onto the global stage, particularly the vibrant acrylic dot paintings from the Central Desert. This art movement emerged from the secret sand paintings used in ceremonies. By transferring them to canvas, artists found a way to share the beauty and power of their culture with the world while still veiling its deepest sacred secrets, a practice that continues to generate both economic independence and immense cultural pride. This hard-won resilience forms the very bedrock of modern reconciliation efforts in Australia and a profound redefinition of national identity. The survival of Aboriginal languages, over 120 are still spoken today, with many more being actively revived through community-led programs, is a direct result of the elders who whispered them to children on those missions. The vibrant contemporary indigenous culture, expressed in film, music, literature, and dance, draws its authentic power from the unbroken, though often hidden, line connecting it to the past. The journey towards reconciliation, however incomplete, is built upon the growing recognition of this incredible survival story. It is an acknowledgement that Australian history does not begin with Captain Cook, but with the first peoples who have nurtured the continent for over 65,000 years and who fought, often in complete secrecy, to protect their sacred legacy. Their story offers a crucial lesson for the entire world on the nature of true resilience. It demonstrates that cultural survival is not always a loud public stand. Sometimes it is the quiet, steadfast decision of a grandmother to teach a child a forbidden word, of an artist to paint a story in a hidden cave, or of a community to gather under the cover of darkness to sing the songs of their ancestors. It is the powerful understanding that the most enduring forms of resistance are often those that are never seen, a testament to the fact that a culture can never be truly eradicated as long as there are people who hold its memory safe in their hearts, waiting for the dawn when it can be sung aloud once more. The utter devastation of Japan in 1945 is almost impossible to overstate. The nation lay in absolute ruin, its cities reduced to seas of ash and twisted metal by relentless firebombing, its industrial capacity shattered, and its spirit broken by the unprecedented horror of 2 atomic blasts. The official surrender to Allied forces ushered in not peace, but a period of profound humiliation and direct military occupation, primarily by the United States under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The initial policy of the supreme commander for the Allied powers was one of demilitarization and democratization, which included a deliberate and systematic dismantling of the very engines that had powered Japan's pre-war economy. The great industrial and financial conglomerates known as the Zaibatsu houses like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo were officially targeted for dissolution. These vast networks, which had dominated the Japanese economy with their interlocking ownership of banks, industries, and trading companies, were seen as having been complicit in fueling Japan's militaristic expansion. The Allied occupation authorities believed that by breaking up these colossal entities, they could prevent the re-emergence of a war-making state and foster a new, decentralized economic system built on American ideals of free market competition. On the surface, it appeared that Japan's economic heart had been stopped, its body politic completely controlled by a foreign power. But beneath this surface of imposed order and public compliance, a different, far more resilient story was unfolding in the shadows, a story of clandestine deals, whispered agreements, and a fierce, secret determination to reassemble the scattered pieces of national power. The first and most immediate response to the collapse was the spontaneous eruption of a massive black market, which became the literal lifeline for a starving population. With official distribution channels in chaos and food rations woefully inadequate, nearly everyone was forced to participate in this illicit economy just to survive. These markets sprang up in the burnt-out shells of train stations and in the rubble-strewn lots of every major city, vibrant, chaotic arenas where cigarettes and canned goods from American GIs were traded for family heirlooms and where desperate farmers bartered sweet potatoes for precious cloth. But this was merely the visible layer of a much deeper and more significant underground economy. The real covert action was taking place in the scorched boardrooms and among the displaced managers of the supposedly dismantled Zaibatsu. While the occupation authorities worked to break up the formal holding companies at the top, the intricate human and commercial networks that formed the true lifeblood of these conglomerates proved incredibly resilient. The personal relationships between mid-level executives, the loyalties between a parent company and its subordinate suppliers, and the intricate knowledge of production and distribution channels, these were assets that could not be erased by a legal decree. Former managers and engineers began to meet in secret, in quiet tea houses and private homes, away from the scrutiny of American officials. They forged gentlemen's agreements and oral contracts, creating a hidden web of collaboration that effectively bypassed the occupation's anti-monopoly laws. They began to quietly reassemble supply chains, divert scarce materials, and plan for a future industrial revival, all while maintaining the public facade of compliance with the ordered breakup. This period also saw the birth of clandestine innovation hubs in the most unlikely of places. With many major factories destroyed, small, unassuming workshops became the nurseries of Japan's future technological dominance. In a converted shed or a repurposed warehouse, groups of engineers who had worked on military projects during the war now turned their skills to peacetime applications. They tinkered and experimented with limited resources, often reverse engineering American products that had entered the country. The focus was on improving quality and efficiency, not for immediate profit, but for the sheer necessity of doing more with less. This culture of Kaizen, or continuous improvement, was honed in these hidden workshops. It was a quiet, grinding dedication to perfection that would later become a hallmark of Japanese manufacturing. Furthermore, there was a concerted, discreet effort to preserve corporate culture and knowledge. Companies that were officially defunct continued to hold unofficial reunions for their employees. Senior managers made it their secret mission to keep their workforces intellectually engaged, organizing private study groups to discuss the latest American management theories and industrial techniques. They were, in effect, keeping their human capital, the skills, the company loyalty, the shared sense of purpose warm and ready for the day they could officially reassemble. This was a patient, long-term investment in the most valuable asset of all, knowledge and institutional memory. The role of the Japanese government in this covert rebuilding was subtle yet crucial. While publicly implementing the reforms demanded by MacArthur's staff, a faction within the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, acted as the secret architect of the economic revival. MITI bureaucrats, many of whom had managed the wartime planned economy, now used their expertise to guide the hidden reassembly of Japanese industry. They became the behind-the-scenes conductors of this economic orchestra, using their regulatory power to protect fledgling domestic industries from foreign competition, strategically allocating scarce foreign currency for the purchase of key Western technologies, and encouraging mergers and collaborations that flew under the radar of the occupation authorities. They funneled information and opportunities to the right people in the old Zaibatsu networks, effectively picking winners and nurturing them in a protected environment. This was not the free market the Americans were trying to impose. It was a brilliantly executed form of state-guided capitalism, disguised as compliance. The economist Chalmers Johnson, in his seminal work MITI and the Japanese Miracle, masterfully documented this phenomenon. He termed Japan a developmental state, arguing that its incredible post-war growth was not a miracle of the free market but the result of a plan-rational system where the state, in close cooperation with business, set strategic goals for the national economy. Johnson wrote that this system relied on a powerful, elite bureaucracy that could exert its leadership in the absence of a national crisis that would serve as the functional equivalent of war. In the immediate post-war years, that leadership was necessarily clandestine, operating in the space between American orders and Japanese intentions. The culmination of all this hidden effort was the eventual public rebirth of the Zaibatsu in a new, legally acceptable form, the Karetsu. As the Cold War intensified and American priorities shifted from punishing Japan to building it into a bulwark against communism in Asia, the occupation's zeal for trust-busting evaporated. The old Zaibatsu networks, which had never truly gone away, now emerged into the light. They reorganized themselves not around a single holding company, but around a powerful central bank, with cross-shareholding arrangements among the member firms. The names were the same: Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, but the structure was more diffuse, designed to withstand legal challenges. The human networks, the loyalties, and the coordinated strategy, however, remained intact. These karetsu became the titans that drove the Japanese economic miracle of the 1960s and 70s, conquering global markets with their automobiles and electronics. The period of covert rebuilding had given them an incredible advantage. While the world saw a sudden, astonishing rise from the ashes, it was in fact the product of years of meticulous, hidden preparation. The patient work in those small workshops had honed the quality that made Japanese products famous. The clandestine meetings had preserved the management structures capable of executing complex, long-term industrial strategy. The state-guided protectionism had given their industries the time to grow strong without being crushed by foreign competition. Japan's transformation into a global economic powerhouse was perhaps history's most dramatic example of how a nation can use economic secrecy, the patient reassembly of networks in the shadows, and strategic state guidance to engineer a total national rebirth, proving that sometimes the most powerful recoveries are those that are planned and executed away from the watching eyes of the world. When we think of the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, a common image emerges of a continent plunged into intellectual twilight, a long slumber between the glories of Rome and the awakening of the Renaissance. It is a picture of crumbling roads, deserted cities, and forgotten knowledge, but this bleak narrative misses a far more fascinating and crucial truth. The light of learning was never truly extinguished. It was merely sheltered, its flame carefully guarded in a scattered network of secretive sanctuaries that operated like a clandestine intellectual resistance movement. While war and societal collapse raged outside, a quiet, determined project of preservation was underway within the thick walls of remote monasteries, the bustling courtyards of Islamic houses of wisdom, and the hidden schools of persecuted scholars. This was not a time of stagnation, but of strategic retreat, a period where human knowledge was concentrated, protected, and quietly advanced in hidden corners of the world, ensuring that the collective wisdom of antiquity would survive to fuel a future rebirth. In the rain-swept isolation of early medieval Ireland, a unique form of sanctuary emerged, never fully conquered by Rome and largely untouched by the initial waves of invasion that shattered the continent. Irish monasteries became unexpected arks for classical learning. Places like Skellig Michael, a dizzying pinnacle of rock rising from the Atlantic, or the remote settlement at Glendalough, were not chosen for convenience but for their profound separation from a chaotic world. Here, Irish monks undertook a task they saw as a sacred duty, the meticulous copying of every text they could lay their hands on. As the historian David Lindbergh powerfully articulated, the role of these monastic scribes was absolutely fundamental. He noted that without their patient, unglamorous work of preservation, the vast majority of classical Latin literature would have been irretrievably lost. These men would spend their entire lives in chilly scriptoriums, hunched over vellum sheets, their hands tracing the words of Virgil, Plato, and Aristotle by the faint light of seal oil lamps. They did not merely copy, they became the silent librarians of a collapsing civilization, preserving the seeds of science, philosophy, and history within the beautifully illuminated pages of manuscripts like the Book of Kells. This was a monumental act of faith, a belief that these ideas mattered and must be saved for a future generation they would never see. Their work ensured that when Europe was finally ready to rediscover its classical heritage, the texts would still exist, safely stored in library treasuries across the island, waiting to be rediscovered and disseminated back to a continent beginning to stir from its long sleep. While Irish monks were preserving the legacy of the Latin West, a spectacular and very public flourishing of knowledge was occurring in the East under the Abbasid Caliphate. In the brilliant new capital of Baghdad, the Caliph al-Ma'mun established the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, in the early 9th century. This was not a hidden monastery, but a grand, state-sponsored research institute that became the epicenter of a global intellectual revolution. Its mission was breathtakingly ambitious: to seek out and translate all the world's knowledge into Arabic. Scholars were sent across the known world to acquire Greek, Persian, Indian, and even Chinese manuscripts. At its height, the House of Wisdom employed an army of translators, scribes, and scholars from every faith and background. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians all worked side by side. They did not merely preserve ancient texts, they actively debated, criticized, and built upon them. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and Euclid were not just saved from oblivion, they were meticulously translated, annotated, and expanded. In the fields of mathematics, scholars like Al-Khwarizmi systemized algebra and introduced the revolutionary Indian numeral system, including the concept of zero to the West. In optics, Ibn al-Haytham conducted rigorous experiments that overturned ancient Greek misconceptions about vision. In medicine, the Canon of Medicine by Ibn Sina became the standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries. The House of Wisdom and other centers like it in Cordoba and Cairo transformed Arabic into the language of science, creating a vast repository of advanced knowledge that would later flow back into a Europe that was only just beginning to recover. This flow of ideas back into Christendom was itself a process often shrouded in necessity and secrecy. The primary points of contact were the multicultural frontier regions of medieval Europe, particularly Sicily and Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars lived in close proximity. In the Spanish city of Toledo, after it was reconquered by Christian forces in the 11th century, a monumental translation project began in the shadows. Archbishop Raymond established a formal school of translators, but the work was done by a fascinating coalition of individuals. A classic pattern would involve a Jewish scholar, fluent in Arabic, translating a text orally into the vernacular Romance language, which a Christian cleric would then translate into Latin. This was a clandestine and painstaking intellectual pipeline, moving the vast treasure of knowledge preserved and advanced in the Islamic world across a deep cultural and linguistic barrier. These translated texts, covering everything from astronomy and medicine to chemistry and philosophy, began to circulate secretly among a small network of European intellectuals, first in the great medieval universities like Bologna and Paris. They were explosive. They presented a view of the natural world that was far more sophisticated and empirically based than the limited classical knowledge that had survived in Europe. The recovery of Aristotle's works on logic, in particular, through these Arabic translations and commentaries, completely revolutionized European thought, challenging theologians and philosophers to reconcile faith with a new kind of reason. This slow, secretive transfusion of knowledge from the Islamic world to the Latin West provided the essential raw material, the intellectual fuel, for the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution that would follow. The story of these secret scientific communities, from the windswept scriptoriums of Ireland to the vibrant halls of Baghdad, offers a profound correction to the myth of the Dark Ages. It reveals that human progress is rarely a continuous upward march, but more often a cycle of dispersal and regrouping, of public collapse and hidden preservation. The work of the monks, the translators, and the scholars of the House of Wisdom was a long-term investment in the human intellect, a patient safeguarding of ideas whose time had not yet come. They understood that knowledge is the most resilient resource of any civilization, and that its preservation is the highest form of hope. By choosing to become the guardians of learning in a world that seemed to have forgotten its value, they ensured that the great conversation of human inquiry was never broken, only paused. They proved that even when the grand libraries of antiquity burn and the great cities fall, civilization can endure in the quiet dedication of a solitary scribe, in the collaborative spirit of a multicultural academy, and in the secret network of translators passing a precious text from one language to another, keeping the flame of discovery alive until the world is once again ready to step in. Its light, the early 20th century, brought a cataclysm of unimaginable horror for the Armenian people, an event that would not only shatter their ancient homeland but scatter their survivors to the farthest corners of the globe. The Armenian genocide of 1915, systematically orchestrated by the Ottoman government, sought to eliminate the Armenian presence from Anatolia through a brutal campaign of mass deportations, death marches, and outright massacres. By the time the killings subsided, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians had perished, and those who survived found themselves as refugees in a hostile world, stripped of their homes, their possessions, and their very sense of place. This forced dispersion, this diaspora, created a profound existential crisis. How does a people maintain their identity when their physical and cultural heartland has been violently erased from the map? The answer was not found in a single act of defiance, but in 1,000 quiet, clandestine decisions made in communities from Beirut to Boston, from Buenos Aires to Paris. The Armenians chose a path of secretive, decentralized preservation, building an invisible nation of memory and tradition that existed not within borders, but within the walls of their homes, their churches, and their community centers, safeguarding their soul until the day it could safely be brought back into the light. This monumental task of cultural survival fell to the most fundamental unit of society, the family. Within the privacy of their own homes, a powerful and secret curriculum was enacted. Grandparents, who are often the last living links to the lost homeland, became the most vital teachers. They whispered the old stories to their grandchildren, tales of Mount Ararat and the ancient kingdoms of Tigranes the Great. They taught the language not through formal grammar lessons, but through lullabies, through the names of traditional foods like lomajaun and paklava, and through the gentle correction of a mispronounced word. The Armenian kitchen became a sanctuary of identity, where the grinding of spices for bastama or the rolling of dough for lavash was not just meal preparation, but a sacred ritual connecting them to a landscape they could no longer see. This domestic transmission was a deeply personal act of resistance, ensuring that even if the outside world demanded assimilation, the inner world of the home remained unmistakably and proudly Armenian. It was here that the trauma of the past was transformed into a determination for the future, a silent promise from one generation to the next that they would not be the last to call themselves Armenian. Beyond the family hearth, the community organized itself into a sophisticated network of clandestine institutions designed to formally educate the youth. In countless cities across the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas, secret Armenian schools began to operate, often held in the basements of churches or in unmarked community halls. Attendance was not mandatory by any state law, but by a far more powerful moral imperative. Here, children learned to read and write in the unique Armenian alphabet, a script invented by Saint Mesrop Mashtots in the 5th century, and which became a powerful symbol of their distinct identity. They were taught a history that was denied by the perpetrators of the genocide and ignored by the history books of their host nations. They learned about their ancient Christian faith, not just as a religion, but as the bedrock of their national character for over 1,700 years. These schools were funded by the meager donations of a community that was often struggling economically itself, a testament to the absolute priority placed on education as the key to survival. The teachers were volunteers, driven by a sense of duty to ensure that the next generation would not grow up as cultural orphans, ignorant of the rich tapestry of their heritage. The Armenian Apostolic Church served as the other indispensable pillar of this hidden nation. More than just a place of worship, the church became the central organizing hub for the entire diaspora. In the diaspora, the church was often the first institution built, a tangible piece of the homeland on foreign soil. Its distinctive architecture, with its conical domes and intricate stonework, provided a visual anchor for the community. Within its walls, the ancient liturgy was performed in classical Armenian, a language that resonated with the echoes of centuries. The church organized cultural events, youth groups, and charitable societies, creating a self-contained ecosystem where Armenians could live much of their social and spiritual lives insulated from the pressures of assimilation. It was here that marriages were sanctified, children were baptized, and the dead were mourned according to ancient rites, creating a continuous cycle of life that reaffirmed their identity at every key milestone. The church, in essence, became a portable homeland, a sovereign state of the spirit that no government could dismantle. The renowned historian Richard Hovhannissian, a towering figure in Armenian studies, spent his life documenting this incredible story of resilience. He famously described the diaspora not as a scattering, but as a reformation, a purposeful gathering of the fragments into a new, global whole. He argued that the clandestine work of preservation in the diaspora was in fact a proactive act of nation-building. The Armenian genocide created a new Armenia, Hovhannissian noted, an Armenia of the spirit and of the will, which existed in the hearts and minds of the survivors and their descendants. This was not merely about clinging to a lost past. It was about actively creating a viable future for Armenianness on a global scale. The networks formed between these scattered communities through newspapers, political parties like the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, and later through digital communication created a web of mutual support and shared purpose. A family in Los Angeles could feel connected to the struggles of a family in Beirut through this intricate, invisible lattice of communication and solidarity. This decades-long global project of cultural stealth ultimately enabled a spectacular public revival. The diaspora did not just preserve Armenian culture, it amplified it, nurturing world-class artists, composers, writers, and intellectuals who brought Armenian themes to an international audience. The composer Aram Khotchaturian, the painter Arshile Gorky, and the filmmaker Atom Egoyan all drew deeply from the wellspring of their heritage, often informed by the diaspora experience. The political activism of the diaspora was also crucial, tirelessly working for decades to achieve international recognition of the genocide, a campaign that finally bore significant fruit in the 21st century. When the Republic of Armenia regained its independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was to this global, prepared diaspora that it turned for expertise, investment, and cultural connection. The secret schools had produced engineers and doctors who could help rebuild the homeland. The hidden networks now facilitated business and trade. The model of the Armenian diaspora offers a profound lesson to all displaced peoples. It demonstrates that a nation is not solely defined by its geographical territory, but by the unbreakable will of its people to remember, to organize, and to teach. It proves that through hidden cohesion, through the quiet, determined work of safeguarding language, faith, and memory in the intimate spaces of home and community, a people can not only endure the worst attempts at eradication, but can actually thrive, weaving their ancient identity into the very fabric of the modern world. Imagine the sound of a saxophone weeping a lonely, bluesy melody, but not in a smoky club in New Orleans or Chicago. Instead, this forbidden music is being played in a cramped, dimly lit apartment in Moscow, the windows stuffed with blankets to muffle the sound, the listeners sitting in tense, rapt silence, knowing that a single complaint from a neighbor could bring the secret police crashing through the door. This was the reality for jazz in the Soviet Union for much of the 20th century. In the eyes of the Communist Party, jazz was not merely music, it was a dangerous, insidious cultural weapon of the West. It was decadent, it was individualistic, and it was profoundly un-Soviet. Starting in the late 1940s, under the rigid cultural orthodoxy of Stalinism, jazz was officially banned, its records confiscated, its performers denounced, and its very rhythms condemned as morally corrupting. An art form born from the expression of freedom was declared an enemy of the state, yet against all odds it did not die. It was driven into the city's basements and the people's hearts, beginning one of the most remarkable stories of clandestine cultural preservation in modern history, a testament to the fact that you cannot silence a rhythm that has already found its way into the soul of a people. The survival of jazz relied on a vast, decentralized, and secretive network of devotees who became masters of improvisation in life, not just in music. The most vital nodes in this network were the kvartalniki, or apartment concerts. These were illicit gatherings in private homes where a brave musician would perform for a small, trusted audience. The risk was immense. Possession of bootlegged American records or sheet music could lead to years in a labor camp. Simply gathering for such an event was an act of defiance. To avoid detection, organizers would use a system of passwords and trusted messengers to spread the word, and attendees would arrive separately, never in a large group that might attract attention. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with a mix of exhilaration and fear. The music was often played on battered, makeshift instruments, and the sound was kept to a whisper. But in that hushed environment, every note carried immense weight. These were not passive listeners, they were participants in a shared ritual of cultural resistance. When the last note faded, the record's often precious, scratchy vinyl discs of Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington that had been smuggled into the country by sailors or diplomats would be carefully hidden away, and the attendees would slip back out into the Soviet night, carrying the forbidden sound with them in their memories. The lifeline that connected these isolated apartment concerts was an ingenious underground economy of sound. In an era before digital duplication, fans and musicians developed a primitive but effective bootlegging technology, ripping recordings onto discarded X-ray plates. These flimsy, ghostly discs, known as music on ribs or bones, were the samizdat of the jazz world. You could buy them from shady dealers in back alleys for a few rubles. Holding one up to the light, you could see the faint image of a broken limb or a human skull behind the grooves, a haunting juxtaposition of life and art, of death and swinging rhythm. The sound quality was terrible, a thin, tinny whisper full of surface noise, but it was enough. For a generation of Soviet youth, hearing the faint, crackling trumpet of Charlie Parker on an X-ray record was a revolutionary act. It was a direct, unmediated connection to a world of freedom and individuality that was otherwise completely inaccessible. This clandestine circulation of music created a secret, nationwide community. You could be a geology student in Siberia or a factory worker in Leningrad, and through these shared, illicit recordings, you were part of a hidden tribe that understood the coded language of bebop and swing. The historian S. Frederick Starr, in his definitive work Red and Hot, The Fate of Jazz in the Soviet Union, brilliantly captures how this musical underground transformed jazz into a potent symbol. He argues that jazz became a surrogate for a whole complex of attitudes and values associated with the West. It wasn't just about the music itself, it was about what the music represented. The improvisational core of jazz stood in direct opposition to the rigid, preordained compositions of state-sanctioned music. It celebrated spontaneous individual expression over collective conformity. The very clothes associated with jazz, the sharp suits, the narrow ties, were a silent protest against drab, utilitarian Soviet fashion. To be a still yoga or style hunter, a young man obsessed with American jazz and culture, was to make a public statement without saying a word, even if it meant facing ridicule from Komsomol gangs. This symbolic power made the jazz underground a precursor to later dissident movements. It provided a framework for resisting not through political pamphlets or open protests, which were instantly crushed, but through cultural affiliation, through a shared aesthetic of freedom that was harder for the authorities to pin down and eradicate. This decades-long underground cultivation of jazz and other banned Western music did far more than just preserve a musical genre. It actively prepared the ground for the cultural and political thaw that would eventually come. When state controls began to loosen slightly during the Khrushchev era and later during Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika in the 1980s, the energy did not come from nowhere. It emerged from the clandestine networks that had been keeping the flame alive. The musicians who had honed their craft in secret apartment concerts were now ready to perform in public. The audiences who had been educated on bootlegged X-ray records were now hungry for more. Jazz clubs that had operated semi-clandestinely could now open more openly, becoming vital spaces for cultural and political discussion. The struggle to appreciate jazz had taught an entire generation critical lessons about autonomy, about the value of cultural exchange, and about the power of art to challenge authority. This underground foundation was crucial for the explosion of artistic freedom that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Rock music, avant-garde art, and uncensored literature did not suddenly appear in a vacuum. They built upon the networks of production, distribution, and audience that the jazz underground had painstakingly developed over decades. The secret history of Soviet jazz is a powerful lesson in cultural resilience. It proves that art does not need official approval to survive and thrive. Sometimes its most powerful and enduring form is not the grand public performance, but the secret, shared whisper in a darkened room, a quiet promise of freedom that, once heard, can never be forgotten. In our increasingly digital world, a new kind of collapse has emerged, one that doesn't level cities but erases entire communities with the click of a button. The sudden shutdown of a popular online platform, a ruthless act of censorship by an authoritarian regime, or a catastrophic server failure, these are the modern-day equivalents of an invasion or a plague, instantly dissolving the vibrant, intricate societies that had formed in the digital realm. When a beloved forum, a bustling social network, or a creative hub vanishes overnight, its users are left as digital refugees, scattered and disconnected, their shared culture, inside jokes, and accumulated knowledge seemingly wiped from existence. Yet, just like the historical kingdoms we've explored, these communities possess a powerful instinct for survival. They don't simply mourn their loss and disperse. They immediately begin the work of a secret digital rebirth, vanishing into the encrypted layers of the internet to protect their unique way of life from the forces that sought to erase it. This process of digital exodus often begins within minutes of a platform's collapse, on the very ruins of the old world. As soon as news breaks that a site is going offline, a frantic yet organized effort launches across remaining communication channels. Users flock to temporary Discord servers or hastily created subreddits, using them as digital refugee camps to regroup and plan. The first order of business is always the same: finding everyone. Members post contact information for encrypted messaging apps like Signal or Telegram, creating lifelines to pull their fellow community members out of the digital silence. The next, more difficult task is the rescue operation for the community's most precious resource, its collective knowledge. If there's any warning at all, users will employ automated scripts to scrape and archive thousands of forum threads, wiki pages, and image galleries. These digital time capsules, often stored on decentralized file networks like the Interplanetary File System, become the sacred texts of the fallen community, ensuring that its history and wisdom are not lost forever. This initial chaotic phase is a testament to the profound human need for connection. The drive to reassemble the tribe is so powerful that it activates immediately, transforming panic into purposeful action. With the community accounted for and its knowledge secured, the real work of building a new, hidden home begins. This almost always involves a strategic retreat to more resilient and censorship-resistant technologies. For many, this means moving to decentralized, open-source platforms that cannot be so easily unplugged by a single company or government. Some communities resurrect themselves on federated networks like Mastodon, which operates like a constellation of independent but interconnected servers, ensuring that no central authority can ever again decide their fate. Others, seeking even greater anonymity and security, take the more radical step of vanishing into the dark web, establishing new forums on hidden services within the Tor network. These onion sites are inaccessible to standard web browsers, creating a digital fortress where members can communicate and collaborate away from the surveillance and interference of corporations or states. Here, in these encrypted enclaves, the community's culture is not just preserved, it often evolves and intensifies, freed from the algorithms and content moderation policies of mainstream platforms. These groups can explore niche interests, develop unique norms, and engage in frank discussion without fear of deplatforming, fostering a level of trust and collaboration that is rare on the open web. The innovation that flourishes in these hidden digital spaces is remarkable. Tech experts who study these communities, like those at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, point out that they often become hotbeds for technological development out of sheer necessity. When you are building a society from the ground up on the fringes of the internet, you are forced to create your own tools. We've seen hidden forums pioneer new encryption methods, develop novel privacy-focused communication protocols, and create entirely new models for democratic online governance. These are not just social clubs, they are digital city-states experimenting with new forms of social organization and digital rights. The very act of rebuilding in secret forces a community to become more self-reliant, more technically savvy, and more deeply invested in the principles of digital freedom. The knowledge gained in these experiments doesn't stay locked away. It often filters back out to the mainstream, influencing the development of more secure and user-respecting technologies for everyone. In this way, these digital refuges act as innovation labs for the entire internet, testing the boundaries of what is possible in a free and open digital society. The parallels to the historical kingdoms we've discussed are both striking and profoundly instructive. The Minoans fleeing to mountain villages, the Khmer building hidden canal networks in the jungle, the Tibetan Buddhists seeking sacred valleys, they all chose geographical isolation as their shield. Today's digital communities choose technological isolation, using encryption and decentralization as their protective geography. The core human impulse is identical. When your world is destroyed, you withdraw to a defensible position, you gather your people, you preserve your sacred texts, and you begin the slow, careful work of rebuilding your culture away from hostile eyes. This pattern reveals a fundamental truth about resilience, whether in the physical or the digital realm. It is not about building an impenetrable fortress that can withstand any attack. It is about building a system that is redundant, adaptable, and decentralized enough to reassemble itself after an attack. It's about ensuring that the knowledge of how to rebuild is distributed among the people, not locked away in a vulnerable central repository. The lessons from these hidden digital kingdoms are urgent and vital for our time. They teach us that our online lives are not ephemeral or insignificant. They are the modern agora, the new commons where culture is made and preserved. And just as we would protect our physical museums and libraries, we must learn to architect our digital spaces for survivability, ensuring that the communities we build today have the tools to endure the collapses of tomorrow, emerging from the encrypted shadows to begin again. Imagine the sudden, terrifying silence of a nation's economic engine shutting down almost overnight. For Cuba, the year 1991 brought exactly that kind of catastrophic collapse. For decades, the island's entire agricultural system had been utterly dependent on the Soviet Union, a classic example of industrialized monoculture fueled by a constant flow of cheap oil, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides from its communist patron. Vast state-owned farms stretched across the countryside, dedicated to producing sugar and a handful of other cash crops for export. In return, Soviet ships arrived in Havana's harbor laden with wheat, meat, and over half of the island's entire food supply. This was not a system built for self-reliance. It was a precarious bargain that vanished into thin air with the dissolution of the USSR. Almost instantly, the oil stopped flowing. Tractors ran out of fuel and sat idle in fields. The factories that produced agrochemicals ground to a halt. Without pesticides, crop yields plummeted. The rationed food that Cubans relied on became desperately scarce. The average citizen lost up to 20 pounds in what Fidel Castro himself grimly dubbed the special period in a time of peace. It was a euphemism for a national famine, a full-scale societal collapse triggered not by war or natural disaster, but by the severing of an economic lifeline. The question was not how to recover a way of life, but how to invent an entirely new one from scratch. And the answer would not be found in boardrooms or government palaces, but in the backyards, vacant lots, and rooftops of every city and town. Faced with the very real specter of mass starvation, the Cuban people had no time for grand, top-down solutions. Their response was immediate, decentralized, and born of pure necessity. They looked around at their concrete urban landscapes and saw not limitations but potential. In a breathtakingly short period of time, the island underwent the largest and fastest transition to organic agriculture the world has ever seen. This was not a choice motivated by environmental idealism. It was a desperate, ingenious act of survival. Without access to petroleum-based inputs, they had to relearn everything. City dwellers who had never planted a seed in their lives began tearing up their patios and balconies to grow lettuce and tomatoes in whatever containers they could find. Vacant lots between apartment buildings, once dumping grounds for rubble, were cleared by hand and transformed into lush, communal vegetable gardens. Even the wide medians of highways in Havana were commandeered for food production. These weren't hidden in the traditional sense of being physically concealed, but they operated outside the defunct industrial system, a quiet, grassroots rebellion against the very idea of dependence. This urban farming revolution was so successful that it fundamentally redefined the geography of food. Suddenly, the source of your next meal wasn't a distant state farm or an import ship that might never come. It was a few blocks away, grown by your neighbor. This dramatically shortened supply chain was incredibly resilient, required no fossil fuels for transportation, and created a new, hyper-local economy. The innovation that emerged from this crisis was nothing short of remarkable. With chemical pesticides unavailable, Cuban farmers became world experts in biological pest control. They developed small, local centers for breeding beneficial insects, ladybugs to eat aphids, parasitic wasps to target caterpillars, and distributed them to gardens across the island. Without synthetic fertilizers, they mastered the art of composting every available scrap of organic waste and employed age-old techniques like crop rotation and intercropping to keep the soil fertile. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of this period is the organoponico, a uniquely Cuban invention. These are raised bed gardens, often constructed from low walls of concrete or stone, filled with a mix of soil and compost. They allowed for intensive food production on poor or compacted urban land that was previously considered useless for farming. The government, recognizing the life-saving potential of this grassroots movement, eventually got on board, formalizing the use of unused state land for these purposes and providing support and research from agronomists. But the real driving force was always the people themselves, sharing knowledge through informal networks, experimenting with what worked, and bartering their surplus. A tomato grower might trade with someone who kept rabbits for meat, who might then trade with someone who had saved seeds from a particularly resilient bean variety. This created a vibrant, informal barter economy that operated alongside the crippled official currency system, a hidden web of exchange that kept communities nourished and connected. The agroecologist Miguel Altieri, who has studied the Cuban model extensively, argues that this period created something far more valuable than just a way to avoid starvation. It forged a new paradigm of food sovereignty. Altieri points out that Cuba moved from a system of passive food dependency to one of active, local control over its food production. The focus shifted from growing cash crops for a foreign market to growing diverse, nutritious food for the immediate community. This model is incredibly relevant for a world facing its own impending crises of peak oil, climate change, and supply chain instability. Cuba's accidental experiment became a masterclass in sustainability, demonstrating that a society can not only survive but actually improve its health and resilience by breaking free from a fossil fuel-addicted agricultural system. The special period was a horrific trauma that no one would ever wish to repeat, but the response it triggered offers a powerful, hopeful blueprint. It proves that within the deepest crisis lies the seed of incredible innovation. By turning inwards and harnessing the power of community, cooperation, and ecological wisdom, a society can secretly rebuild itself from the ground up, creating a model of resilience that could one day nourish the entire world. Language is so much more than just a tool for communication. It is the living soul of a people, a unique window into how an entire culture perceives the world, remembers its history, and understands its place in the universe. When a language is lost, an entire library of human thought and experience is burned to the ground. For centuries, dominant powers have understood this intimately, systematically targeting indigenous and minority languages as a primary weapon of conquest and control. From the boarding schools of North America, where native children were beaten for speaking their mother tongue, to the formal bans on languages like Basque and Hawaiian in public life, the message was brutally clear: to assimilate, you must first forget. Your words are worthless, your stories are invalid. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming pressure designed to induce cultural amnesia, a powerful, secret form of resistance took root. It did not happen on battlefields or in political assemblies, but in the most intimate of spaces, in the hushed whispers of a grandmother's kitchen, in the hidden classrooms of a church basement, and in the clandestine singing of forbidden songs. This is the story of the Hidden Linguistic Revival, a global, grassroots movement where communities became stealthy archivists of their own voices, safeguarding the most vital code of their identity until the day it could be spoken in the sun once more. The strategies for this covert preservation were as diverse as the languages themselves, but they all shared a common thread: the ingenious use of secrecy to create sanctuaries where the language could live, even if only in a whisper. In the Basque countries straddling the border of Spain and France, the Franco regime launched a relentless campaign to eradicate the Basque language, Euskara. It was banned from schools, the media, and all official functions. To speak it publicly was an act of defiance that could bring severe punishment. The response was the creation of the Ikastolak clandestine schools operated in the back rooms of houses, in secluded farmsteads, and in the basements of sympathetic churches. Parents who were fluent would risk everything to teach small groups of children, not just the language itself, but the folk tales, the history, and the songs that were its heart and soul. These were not merely grammar lessons, they were acts of cultural transmission performed in the shadows, ensuring that the next generation would carry the flame. Similarly, in Hawaii, after the overthrow of the kingdom and its subsequent annexation by the United States, the Hawaiian language, Alilo Hawaii, was brutally suppressed. It was outlawed in schools, and children were physically punished for uttering a single word of their native tongue. In response, families made a conscious, dangerous decision. Behind closed doors, they refused to speak English. The home became a linguistic fortress. Grandparents became the unsung heroes of this resistance, insisting on speaking only Hawaiian to their grandchildren, telling them the stories of the Aina, the land, and the exploits of their ancestors, ensuring that the melodic rhythm and deep wisdom of the language would not be silenced within the walls of their own homes. Beyond the spoken word, communities embedded their languages into cultural artifacts, creating a hidden lexicon of resistance. In Wales, during periods of English domination, the intricate art of crafting love spoons became more than a folk tradition. The specific patterns and symbols carved into the wood hearts, knots, chains were a secret visual language, a way for a young man to express his feelings and intentions to a woman without needing to write a letter that might be read and understood by English authorities. In many Native American communities, traditional crafts like beadwork and basket weaving followed patterns that were more than just decorative. They were narrative maps, recording stories and histories in a code that only members of the community could decipher. A seemingly simple basket's design might tell the story of a migration or a significant celestial event, preserving the language's conceptual world in a tangible, yet hidden, form. This transformation of everyday objects into secret texts ensured that the language lived on in a way that was both practical and invisible to the oppressor's eye, a silent rebellion woven into the very fabric of daily life. The work of linguists like Leanne Hinton has been crucial in understanding and supporting these movements. A pioneer in the field of language revitalization, Hinton developed a methodology known as the Master-Apprentice program. This approach formalized the very same clandestine, one-on-one model that communities had instinctively used for generations. It paired an elderly, fluent speaker, a last living repository of the language, with a dedicated younger apprentice. The core rule was simple yet radical. For set periods of time, they would communicate only in the endangered language, while engaging in everyday activities like cooking, gardening, or repairing a car. This wasn't learning from a textbook, it was total immersion in a linguistic safe space, reviving the natural context in which language has always been best acquired. Hinton's insight was profound. She demonstrated that language revival isn't about dusty dictionaries and grammar charts alone. It is about rebuilding the human relationships and cultural contexts that give a language its reason for being. Secrecy in this model is not about fear, but about focus. It creates a protected environment, free from the dominant language's constant noise and pressure, where the fragile seedling of an endangered tongue can be carefully nurtured back to strength. This decades-long, often secretive work of preservation did not just save words from extinction. It stored up an immense potential energy for a dramatic public resurgence when the political and social climate finally began to thaw. The Hawaiian language immersion schools, the Panana Leo, which began operating in the 1980s, are a direct legacy of those families who whispered Alilo Hawaii behind closed doors. They fought for and won the right to educate their children in their native language, and today there are thousands of fluent Hawaiian speakers who are the children and grandchildren of those who were once punished for it. In Wales, the once banned language is now heard on television and radio broadcasts, and Welsh medium schools are a popular and respected choice for families. The hidden Icastolac of the Basque Country evolved into a fully integrated and publicly funded school system that is a cornerstone of Basque cultural pride and autonomy. This public revival is the magnificent flowering of a plant that was kept alive for generations in the cultural greenhouses of homes and hidden classrooms. It proves that a language does not need millions of speakers to survive. It needs a critical mass of dedicated keepers who are willing to become living arks, carrying it through the long winter of suppression. The hidden linguistic revival demonstrates the ultimate power of cultural stealth. It shows that the most effective resistance to erasure is not always a loud protest, but a quiet, stubborn act of love, a mother singing a lullaby in a forbidden tongue, a grandfather telling an old story to a captivated child, a community deciding that some knowledge is too precious to lose and choosing to hide it in the one place it can never be confiscated, in the hearts of its people. As we've journeyed through these incredible stories of secret rebirth, from ancient Minoans to modern digital communities, one theme stands clear: humanity's unyielding spirit to rebuild and endure even in the shadows. These hidden kingdoms, scattered across time and terrain, reveal a profound truth about the nature of collapse itself. It is rarely a permanent ending, but rather a brutal, often necessary, pruning, a clearing away of the old and brittle to make space for something new and more resilient to take root. What emerges from the ashes is not always a grand empire meant to dominate the world stage again. Sometimes it is a quieter, wiser, and more adaptable version of its former self, one that understands the value of secrecy, community, and the fragile, precious things worth protecting. These stories offer us a timeless toolkit for resilience, a set of strategies forged in the crucible of catastrophe. We've seen the power of geographic isolation, where communities like the Minoans or the Khmer retreated into mountains and jungles, using the landscape itself as a shield to buy the time needed for cultural convalescence. We've witnessed the breathtaking effectiveness of cultural stealth, exemplified by the Jewish diaspora and the Pueblo peoples, who mastered the art of living dual lives, safeguarding their most sacred traditions in the privacy of their homes and the silence of their hearts, right under the noses of their oppressors. And we've observed the incredible potency of intellectual secrecy, from the Polish underground state's clandestine universities to the Korean Seoan academies, where the preservation of knowledge, language, and ideas was treated as the highest form of warfare against erasure. Each of these strategies is a masterclass in adaptability, proving that there is no single path to survival, only the universal will to find one. This unbroken thread of clandestine renewal, stretching from the deepest past to our digital present, provides more than just fascinating history. It offers a crucial lens through which to view our own uncertain future. Our world faces its own gathering storms, the looming threats of climate disruption, geopolitical instability, and the fragility of our interconnected digital systems. The lessons from these hidden kingdoms are not relics, they are urgent, living wisdom. They teach us that resilience is not about building higher walls, but about creating deeper roots and more distributed networks. It is about nurturing local knowledge, fostering strong community bonds, and safeguarding the cultural and intellectual seeds that would be needed to replant civilization should the unthinkable occur. They encourage us to ask ourselves, what are the core elements of our own cultures, our environments, and our communities that are truly worth preserving? And what can we do right now to protect them, to ensure they could survive a collapse and form the nucleus of a rebirth? If this exploration into history's greatest comebacks has captivated your imagination, we would love to hear which of these hidden kingdoms resonated most deeply with you. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation about the incredible ingenuity of the human spirit. And if you're eager for more journeys into the shadows of our past, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into history's greatest mysteries. Remember, the grand, sweeping narratives of history often capture our attention, but it is in the quiet, unseen corners of perseverance, in the hidden valleys, the encrypted networks, and the whispered stories that the most powerful acts of rebirth are often nurtured. Sometimes the most profound transformations are the ones history almost missed, simply because they were too busy